Hello ghosts and ghouls, it's been a minute since I last uploaded, and since the next video I'm working on is taking a little longer than expected, I decided to take a page out of Avalanche Review's book and combined all my reviews of the classic Resident Evil trilogy into one long, sexy video. It's okay I'm copying him though, we are butt buddies. Since these videos were finished a while ago and my style has changed, each video looks and sounds a little different than what I'm doing now. But if you want a long ass video about Resident Evil 1, 2 and 3 and can stomach my voice for extended periods of time, you've come to the right place. I hope you enjoy and I'll see y'all soon with a new video. Ciao Bella. In what may be considered a blasphemous statement, especially since my whole channel is dedicated to horror, I have never enjoyed classic Resident Evil. In fact, I hated it. I can't put my finger on what exactly I didn't like about the classic games because there were a myriad of reasons that, when combined, made for a Sunderland hates this with every fibre of his being. So for many years, I just didn't want to play any of them. But I knew I had to at least try them at some point. So last year, I did what's something that most gamers absolutely despise. I played some classic Resident Evil games with a guide. And you know what? I still didn't enjoy it. But I think this time it was my fault. Playing with a guide took away a lot of what makes Resident Evil, while also diminishing the tense and somewhat unforgiving experience that many people have come to love. So like many times before, I just put the series at the back of my mind and became comfortable with my belief that these games weren't for me. That was until I started this channel. I've been doing this for a few months now and I've always wanted to do something special for Halloween. But since my channel is dedicated to horror, I couldn't simply just review another game or make another video. I had to do something that was different or put me out of my comfort zone. And that is when I had this idea. Why not review Resident Evil? But this time, just play it completely blind and experience it in its purest form. It had been a long time since I played a classic Resident Evil game, so I was going in fresh, and I thought it could be a good idea. So here we are. After many years of hating one of the most beloved horror games of all time, I have completed both campaigns in Resident Evil, and I have some thoughts, some sexy thoughts, on Halloween. The story of Resident Evil is beautiful in its simplicity. I'd easily swipe right if it was wearing a furry mask and a diaper. A series of bizarre murders have gone down on the outskirts of Raccoon City, and the super buff and thick members of the Raccoon City Police Department's STARS team have been sent to investigate. Bravo team is the first to be sent in, and well, that doesn't go well. So Alpha Team is sent in to locate their mates, but that doesn't go well either, and they are attacked by monster dog boys. The helicopter they arrived on decides to leave them stranded because helicopters are dicks and are apparently the gender of every alt-right edgelord on the internet, so the crew take refuge in the nearby Spencer mansion, which in no way looks ominous at all or full of nightmares. Once the crew gets in, consisting of Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Big Daddy Barry Burton, and cool guy with slicked back hair and glasses Albert Wesker. They soon find out the mansion has been inhabited by zombies who don't pay rent or clean up after themselves, which is pretty inconsiderate. Other baddie monster boys have also made the mansion their home. The Scooby Gang has to try and survive the horrors in the mansion, try to escape, and uncover why there are loads of zombies and monsters wandering around and killing things. When describing the overall story of Resident Evil, I can't help but compare it to a B-movie. That is for many reasons, but the setup and the acting, which I will get into later, feel like it's ripped out of some so bad it's good horror movie from the 70s or the 80s. It doesn't break any new ground of the zombie formula, and that is because it didn't need to. It was the first entry in the series and came out at a time when zombies weren't as oversaturated as they are today. And it didn't have any of that sequel baggage you don't want customs to search. It was able to do its own thing because it was trying something people hadn't experienced in the dark decade of the 90s. All of the characters are very one-dimensional, and the super bad corporation doing super bad things is dated by today's standards, but it works for what it's trying to do. The plot is not at the forefront of the game anyway, and is mainly used to motivate the player to get them to go where they need to go. There are some slight twists and backstabs to keep the plot somewhat interesting, but it clearly wasn't the main focus. One issue I had with the story is the cutscenes. Not their content, because that is some pure B-grade goodness, but their pacing. After every sentence a character says in these cutscenes, there is a long pause. Like the game is trying to piece together the dialogue in real time. It makes every cutscene drag on, and some of them can get pretty long. long, which exacerbates the problem.
What is it?
Blood. Jill, see if you can find any other clues. I'll be examining this. Hope this is not Chris's blood.
It is like every character in this game has respiratory problems and needs to take long and deep breaths between every sentence they say. This perfectly segues into my next issue of the cutscenes. You can't skip them. Considering how there is a real risk of replaying large portions of this game over and over again, some of which may have several cutscenes where potato people talk about giant snakes and
Jill sandwich
means you have to sit through these slow cutscenes over and over again. I just wish there was an option to skip them. Maybe if the player had already seen them, they could just move the pace along. Capcom knew people would replay this game and try to beat it as fast as possible because they actively encouraged this through unlockables and timing the player at the end. So I don't understand why they thought these cutscenes were that good the player would have to watch them in their entirety every single time they played. Of course, this could be explained by hardware limitations, but they still bug me. Now I can't talk about the cutscenes without mentioning the voice acting. It is a fucking meme at this point. Every single person who reviews this game mentions it and makes the haha funnies about how bad it is. And it's true, it's terrible. But I won't be playing a montage of bad clips or anything like that because it's been done to death. You know it's bad, I know it's bad. But I kinda love it. Mainly because I think it lends to the B-movie vibe this game has. It is basically saying, the plot is kinda dumb and you shouldn't take it seriously. Which is something I always loved about Resident Evil. It really adds to the charm of the game, and without it, I don't think I would have enjoyed it as much. It was nice to giggle after an onslaught of tension. Would the game be better if the voice acting wasn't complete arse? Probably, but it would also lose some of its charm, which I think has become one of the most beloved aspects of Resident Evil. Even though the core story is kind of okay and somewhat held back by pacing issues and bad voice acting, I think the notes the player finds throughout the game are where the story truly shines. Most of the notes are written by Umbrella employees stationed at the mansion. You know, the employees whose heads you've been turning into strawberry jam this entire time. You learn more about Umbrella and their motivations, which is pretty cool, but I think the best notes are when they focus on the struggles of those who were present during the outbreak. The most famous note is the Keeper's Diary. It was written by an Umbrella researcher who was responsible for exterminating animals who had been tested on. Unfortunately for the employee, during the outbreak, he was infected by the T-virus. You get to read about who this person was before they were infected, what their job involved, and their daily routine. And once they become infected, you learn about how the T-virus altered their body and mind, and how they are trying to cope with that. They also describe about how they killed one of their colleagues, but that's what you get for reheating Indian food in the office microwave, you fuck. After reading several entries, the diary ends with the researcher describing how hungry and itchy they are. The final 2 words they wrote before succumbing to the infection were itchy, tasty. After you read the diary, a zombie comes out of a closet and attacks you. That zombie is the man who wrote the diary. Why I love this is throughout the entire game, you have seen so many zombies and you've killed so many of them, but you know nothing about them. But you now know the story of this one zombie, and it makes for a very memorable and pretty emotional encounter. Notes such as this are fantastic as they dispose of the camp and B-movie story of the main game and offer a more darker and human perspective. The diary humanized these monsters. They had lives, family, people they loved, and all these things they have now forgotten. All they want to do now is eat. It is a great use of storytelling. It can be a bit jarring to watch a cutscene with terrible voice acting and awkward dialogue, then read a tragic story about a man losing his mind, but I think the game benefits from the inclusion of notes because it adds to the horror. Overall, I admittedly had a fun time watching Resident Evil's story unfold. You're not going to find anything groundbreaking or particularly engaging here, but I found myself having a pretty fun time when looking at it like a silly horror movie that is a bit self-aware. I would love to see a Netflix series that followed a similar style because it was able to find a balance between camp and horror. When I think of Resident Evil story, camp and horror are immediately what comes to mind, and I hope the other games continue that trend. But let's get on to the meat and potatoes. What is there to say about Resident Evil's gameplay that hasn't already been extensively said? Not a lot, but you haven't heard it from me, Mr. I don't like Resident Evil, so here I go. The gameplay of Resident Evil is quintessential survival horror. All the hallmarks you would expect are here and in their purest form. You probably know each of the aspects of survival horror that I'm going to talk about, but instead of not wasting your time with hearing something you've already heard numerous times, I'm going to waste your time by talking about things you already know about. Throughout your time of Resident Evil, you must tangle several different mechanics that define survival horror. That being item management, limited inventory, clunky controls, limited resources, locked doors, and terrible combat. All these things work in tandem to create the genre we know and love. First, I'm going with the first thing I encountered, and that is the tank controls, and oh boy, do you feel like each player character has treads instead of legs. Each movement is extremely deliberate and you feel like you really have to commit to every step you take. Walking and running in a straight line isn't hard, but turning left or right feels very cumbersome. Obviously, this is the definition of the tank control thing, but as soon as there are enemies in the picture, the reasoning behind their inclusion becomes very evident. Dodging enemies is very difficult when you haven't become accustomed to controls, and I found myself taking damage because Chris and Jill didn't know how to fucking run properly. The controls become more of a pain when enemies are placed in areas of tight turns. This meant I had to fight the controls, dodge enemies while also trying to throw myself around corners with the hopes and dreams of not getting hit. Even though I am complaining about the controls, playing Resident Evil reminded me how much they add to the tension of the game. If I could dart around the enemies like Roadrunner on cocaine, the game may not have been as tense, but because each enemy is a significant obstacle and I don't have full control of the player character, it made even the 10th run-in with a zombie a stressful affair, especially in new areas. Sometimes obstacles will be in the way alongside with monsters, and this puts your skills with the controls to the test. Also, the tank controls are something I did get used to. The game allows you to explore the mansion at the start without any enemies, so you become somewhat accustomed to how the game controls, and after an hour of playing, tank controls become second nature. I can imagine the controls may put off some people, but if you're in that camp, you should still give Resident Evil a try, or any other game with tank controls. Don't worry, tank controls don't bite. The zombies do though. Fuck, I hate myself for making that joke. The second thing I noticed when I started playing was the use of fixed camera angles. The survival horror enthusiast's wet dream. These things are so ingrained in the genre, but only few horror games use them these days, and those are mainly independent titles or titles banking on nostalgia. But are they effective? Well, when used right, I believe so, and luckily, they are executed extremely well in Resident Evil. They show the player the environment without them losing their sense of momentum or direction. They highlight items of interest or puzzles, but my favourite aspect of fixed camera angles is how they hide enemies. Since the cameras are static, the developers really had to get creative with the enemy placement so they could surprise and scare the player, and I think they did a great job of that. Numerous times I walked into a new area only to get surprised by an enemy. Even exploring old areas, which I'd ran through numerous times, always kept me on the edge of my seat, because even though I knew where the enemies were, not being able to see them until I was running towards them creeped me out. And those feelings just prove how well their use hold up 20 plus years later. My only problem with them is transitioning from one screen to the next is a little slow. It usually takes about a second to load, and though this doesn't sound like a long time, it does add up. This also breaks the flow of movement and slows the game down. It can be annoying when I had to backtrack to grab an item, and that process was slowed down because of the angle transitions. Not a massive issue, but one I felt like I needed to address. I don't think every survival horror game needs fixed camera angles, and when they are used badly, they can really ruin a game. But when they are used correctly, they add another layer of tension to a game that some more recent titles can't even think about matching. And I think Resident Evil falls in that "yeah brah, it works" the best category. The player will use their tank controls to explore the Spencer Mansion and its surrounding areas, alongside a super sketchy underground facility that is in no way responsible for the zombies, giant spiders, and garden variety plants that want to kill you. Throughout this little fun excursion, the player will realize they haven't got very large pockets, meaning they have a small inventory space. Each item in the game, whether it is a key, a weapon and its ammo, puzzle pieces, or 420 smoke until you choke healing items, all take up a space in your inventory. Once your pockets are chock full of goodies, you will not be able to carry anything else. Before I played this game for this review, I always found this to be an annoying aspect of the game. I didn't like how it restricted what items I could pick up, but now I see how genius this design decision was. You see, little Mr. or Miss YouTube viewer, a limited inventory significantly adds to the survival aspect of Resident Evil. You can't just go in, packed in the nines of ammo and healing items, because you will soon find that you have no room for other essential items you will need in order to progress. Instead, you need to think about what you are going to take, and more importantly, what are you going to leave behind? Do you need to take extra healing items, or do you think you can progress without taking much damage? What guns are you going to take? And do you think you will need heaps of ammo? Or are you going to try your best to avoid combat? What essential items do you also need to take? These are just some of the questions I was asking myself before I left the comfort zone of the safe room to explore each area. Luckily, each safe room has an item box which the player can use to store resources or items they don't need right now. And in a great design decision, no matter which item box you use throughout the game, the items you stored will appear in them, and you can also store a lot of stuff too. This was a great way at balancing the limited inventory because it meant you didn't have to waste items in order to pick new ones up. You could just store what you didn't need and get the stuff you did need. You still had to think about your inventory, but you at least had some flexibility. And another reason why I was constantly questioning every move I made was because resources in Resident Evil are finite and spread thin. I rarely found loads of ammunition or healing items during both my playthroughs. It always felt the developers gave me just enough to get through the game if I didn't make too many mistakes or wasn't stupid. This decision on behalf of the developers to limit the amount of resources greatly changed how I played the game. In most horror titles, I was cautious but not overly so. I knew I would be able to take some hits or waste some bullets because I always had heaps of them, or I knew there would always be more. I relied on that knowledge. But with Resident Evil, I had to change that mindset completely. Caution was the name of the game. Well, the name of the game is Resident Evil, but you get where I'm going. I would approach each area slowly, analysing the environment and the position of the enemies and trying to figure out the best means of approach, which would result in myself not using any resources. But this also put a lot of weight on each mistake I made. Each bullet shot, each time I needed to heal felt important, and I felt wasteful every time I used a resource. In the back of my mind, I always thought about whether I could have played better and not wasted that healing item or that bullet. And if you are not careful and just play the game without considering what resources are available, you can completely screw yourself over and have to restart. Several times throughout both my playthroughs, I found myself with low ammo or low health because of too many mistakes. This caused me to become a little scaredy cat. Each room and enemy was something that could kill me in a heartbeat, and because I never knew what was coming next, I didn't think I was going to survive. The tension in these moments was palpable. When I did finally stumble across the resources I needed, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Moments like these solidified how important the decision was to limit the amount of resources in order to make the player feel like they are surviving something that is truly horrific. You wouldn't have moments like these if you had a regenerating health or bucket loads of ammo. I used to hate the idea of limited resources because I didn't want to be severely punished when I made too many mistakes or didn't know the game inside out. But now, after sinking many hours into Resident Evil, I wouldn't have this game be any other way. One of the most interesting and important game mechanics in Resident Evil is how the player saves. I could have added this into the inventory section, but I really wanted to discuss it by itself. You see, this game came out in a time long before the comforting cuddle of checkpoints, but other games allowed the player to save as many times as they wanted. Resident Evil threw in a curveball. Sure, you can save like any other game you played before at these things called typewriters, but you can only save if you have an ink ribbon. Ink ribbons are also limited resources, such as the others I mentioned previously. So saving, which is generally a comforting experience, now becomes a part of your survival. You need to think about when and where to save and how frequently you want to save. If you save too much, you will run out of ink ribbons, and you will have to play large portions of the game knowing that if you die, all that progress you just made is lost. But if you save too little and be too cautious, that means you're playing large chunks of the game without a save file as a safety net. It is a fine balance that I was constantly thinking about. There were a couple times in the game where I took out a big boss or covered a large section of the game, but only saved about 30 minutes ago. Sure, I could waste an ink ribbon to make sure I didn't have to do all that again, but what if I needed that ink ribbon down the line and didn't have it? Or another scenario I would face is I only had a few ink ribbons left and I had no idea when I would find some more. I used to completely despise the save system in Resident Evil, but now I have learned to appreciate it and how it adds to the survival horror. If you find that perfect balance of saving when you need to but not too often, the save system won't be too much of a problem. But the fact that I was always thinking about it and was relieved when I finally did save, even though I wasn't sure whether it was a good idea, proves how integral and engaging this system is. Now we've got all that out of the way, let's talk about something else. Since this is a survival horror game, you know that shit has some puzzles, and in my opinion they are really hit and miss in Resident Evil. Some are really cool and force you to think, like the V-jolt puzzle where you have to mix chemicals together. You have to use basic mathematics to create the chemical you needed, and it actually made me stop and really think about what I was doing. I was never good at math, so I actually had to write things down in order to figure out what I needed to do. While I was mixing the chemicals together, I would constantly check back at my notes to make sure I was doing it right. Doing that was really cool, and that's something that is completely lost in horror games. But puzzles such as this are few and far between, and the main puzzle you will encounter is put an item in something or block puzzles. I generally enjoyed the former. Numerous times throughout Resident Evil, your progress will be stopped because you need to find an item to put into a hole or a locked door that needs a specific key. The game map doesn't really tell you any of this information regarding what keys or items go where, so you have to keep it in the back of your mind while playing until you figure out what you need to do. It is also a great way of encouraging the player to explore while also requiring them to paint a mental map of the game. I think this really added to the sense of feeling lost and overwhelmed. I always felt downtrodden when I found something I had no idea what to do with, but also felt so rewarded when I stumbled across what the item was used for. Sure, puzzles such as this, and calling them puzzles, are a bit of a stretch, and they aren't exactly challenging, but they also aren't a nuisance. But Resident Evil also has block puzzles, and they are the absolute worst thing in this game. These block puzzles are annoying because they are slow and feel absolutely pointless because the solution is so obvious and easy that I kept wondering why not just remove them. The best example of a pointless block puzzle is the one in the flooded area underground. You have to push these 3 boxes into this water so you can cross. It is super easy, but holy fuck is it just the worst thing ever. You need to push them down this long ass hallway, and all you have for company is the fucking scratching sound the box makes when it slides against the floor. Yeah, this is some fucking relaxing shit. This isn't fun or interesting. This isn't fun or rewarding. It is just a dumb way of adding an apparent puzzle when in reality, it didn't need to exist. If you take this block puzzle out of the game, nothing of worth is lost, and in fact, it makes the game better because the dumb fucking thing doesn't exist. Luckily, stuffing up a block puzzle can't just straight up kill you, right? Well, you'd be fucking wrong about that, because the very first block puzzle in the game is in a room where you need to push a button to unlock a cabinet to get an essential item to progress. But pushing the button will cause poison gas to come out of 2 vents and kill you. So you need to push these 2 statues over the vents so when you push the button, you don't die. Sounds pretty easy, right? Well, it is, but every time I tried this, I would just miss by a pixel and fucking die by poison. So I would have to run back and slowly push these statues, hoping I had them lined up perfectly, which is made harder because of the fixed camera angles. This example can be boiled down to me being stupid, and honestly that's a pretty good fucking argument, but like every block puzzle in this game, this isn't hard. But fuck me, is it absolutely annoying to die because of it. I am making it out like these block puzzles are the absolute worst thing in the world, and honestly that's because they are. But there aren't that many of them, and the cheap kill you ones only appear like twice, so they aren't that much of a big deal. I just like writing about things that annoy me, then recording those things and putting them into a video where I then upload them onto YouTube for people to watch. I just wish these block puzzles were gone and replaced with more actual puzzles. Just anything else except making me slowly push shit. Speaking of shit being slow, some of the puzzle animations physically aged me. There are several puzzle animations in this game that just take too long to complete. And the funny thing is, these puzzles never require more than a second of thought, some even less than that. The most annoying example of this I found is in the underground. You need to turn this crank to rotate the floor, which allows the player to cross. Okay, no big deal. Easy puzzle to solve, yeah, whatever. The problem is, it takes so damn long. Just watch how long it takes for it to do this. Again, not a massive deal breaker, but it just feels like there are so many things in this game which unintentionally slowed me down. When the game is trying to keep a constant feeling of atmosphere and tension, having to stop every few seconds to do something pointless that takes ages took away from that. After completing Resident Evil, I honestly don't understand why it's known for having puzzles. Most of the puzzles in the game aren't puzzles, not including some really good exceptions of course, and the others involve pushing boxes. I was expecting something more difficult or engaging, but I didn't get that. Most of the puzzles in Resident Evil are just barriers to player progression, and that's fine since that did not frustrate me and I believe that does have its benefits, but I was really expecting more. I just hope in the sequels the puzzles are expanded upon and make my brain do this. Something that is a bit more contentious in the whole argument of, the good parts and bad parts about old school survival horror is backtracking. Its inclusion simultaneously allows the player to become familiar with the game and have that sense of mastering it while also extending the game's playtime. The latter isn't really a problem in Resident Evil as the game is pretty short, but it can be annoying when you find some ammo but your inventory is full, so you have to run back to an item box to get rid of something just to run all the way back to grab the item and then run all the way back to store it. I made that sentence deliberately annoying because it sums up how backtracking can feel sometimes. I was kind of dreading having to run through the same areas over and over again because of what I just explained, but the game is tense enough and that feeling of conquering it really made me forget that I was exploring the same areas most of the time. The levels are small enough so backtracking isn't a long task, and there are several save rooms of item boxes throughout the game, so you don't have to run across the entire map just to store or get what you need. One problem I did have with backtracking is the opening door animations. The main argument for them is that they are a great use of creating tension and initially adds to the atmosphere, but they are damn slow because they hide load times. They honestly lost their charm for me. When I was backtracking through the mansion and had to sit through so many slow door opening animations, I just got sick of them. Again, I understand their reason for existing, but I still find them frustrating. Did you know there are monsters in this mansion? Well, if you didn't, I'm upset that you haven't been paying attention, but thanks for the watch time. The main enemies you'll encounter in Resident Evil are zombies, but you'll also face off against dead zombie dogs, these green assholes who like to jump on you and deal massive damage, spiders, and sharks? Huh, Umbrella just stuck this T-virus into anything, eh? Let's talk about this for a sec though. Humans, I get. Dogs, yeah, okay, sure. You are an evil corporation, you are so evil that you test on the goodest and most pure thing in the world because you want to wave your evil dick around. But like, spiders and sharks, now that's just getting dumb and pointless evil. You already created zombies and monsters. Why do you also need giant spiders and zombie sharks? Sharks already eat people. You don't need to change them to make them deadly, they already are.
I have one simple request. And that is to have sharks with frickin' laser beams attached to their heads.
You encounter some other creatures, but I don't want to reveal too much and this fucking video is too long as it is. Zombies are the most common enemies, and though you will see them all of the time, they are still a threat and they can really fuck up your day if you're grabbed by one. They are slow though, so you can outmaneuver them if you are clever enough. However, the rest of the enemies in the game are fast and they can jump. This ramps up the danger, but can also be frustrating because they have more movement options than the player, and sometimes they will jump from outside the screen, which is just the funnest thing ever. It can also make shooting them a pain in the ass. I can't count how many times I tried shooting a hunter or a dog, but couldn't hit them because they decided to leap into the air and hit me. This just seems like a cheap way of making an enemy deadlier, and made me super aware on how limited I was both in movement and combat options. It didn't make these enemies scarier. I never encountered one of these guys and was like, oh, there's the scares right there. I was more annoyed because I knew I was about to waste bullets and take damage because they can fucking jump. I am down for increasing the difficulty, but giving a major unfair advantage to these enemies to create a semblance of difficulty isn't how I think it should be done. Sure, make them hit harder or move faster, but don't give them bullshit abilities the player has no way of avoiding. Luckily though, the faster enemies aren't everywhere, and they don't pull out the fuck your shit up card too often. One thing I did like about most of the enemies are their designs. They look pretty great for a game on the PS1. The zombies look like zombies. They are covered in blood, their clothes are ripped, and their skin is all pale. The dogs look gross, the hunters look beefy and brutal, and the other enemies later in the game have unique designs that really buttered my rolls. The only enemy I think looks dumb is the giant spider. It's just the giant spider. Nothing especially fucked up about that. Think of a spider, but then like make it bigger. I mean, I would be terrified of that, but I just thought it wasn't as creative as the other enemy designs. And at some point, you will have to actually shoot these enemies. The weapons you get in Resident Evil are a knife, pistol, shotgun, rocket launcher, a magnum, and a flamethrower at one point, but access to that is very limited. The combat in Resident Evil is as bare bones as bare bones. You point your gun and you shoot until the thing in front of you is dead, or if it's a zombie, shoot it until it's dead again. There honestly isn't that much more to it. Even though Resident Evil has combat, it usually is the last thing you want to do. The best idea is to avoid combat altogether and just run past most enemies so you don't waste resources. But that can be very risky because you gotta get up all close and personal with these guys. When to engage in the combat is more of a strategic decision. The only time I thought it was necessary to kill an enemy was if it was placed in an area that I regularly visited, but it was too risky to constantly try and run past them. It is this constant balancing act that makes the simple combat in Resident Evil more engaging than it actually appears, because each bullet you shoot is an important decision you make and you need to truly think about it before pulling the trigger. Thankfully, I played the director's cut of the game, which has the auto aim. That makes the combat a lot more functional considering the use of fixed camera angles. This makes shooting enemies down a hall or in another screen an actual option, which is nice. But the original release had no auto lock, and I think I would rather watch Ben Shapiro videos than play this game without an auto lock feature.
That all of the water levels around the world rise by let's say 5 feet over the next 100 years, say 10 feet by the next 100 years, and it puts all the low-lying areas on the coast underwater. right? Which, let's say all of that happens. You think that people aren't going to just sell their homes and move?
Just one small problem! Sell their houses to who, Ben? Fucking Aquaman!
Actually, on second thought, I think I'm just going to play the game. I guess the combat's simplicity could also be seen as a negative for some if you want something more rewarding or engaging. But I found it enjoyable because I saw combat more as a continuous puzzle that I needed to solve. So in that sense, I think it works. But one of my biggest disappointments of Resident Evil was the boss fights. Boss fights are weird. They are neither good nor bad, they just kind of exist in the game, and honestly, bosses tend to be easier to kill than most of the enemies in the game. You go up against several bosses and use the same tactic with every single one. Stand in one place and shoot them, occasionally move, rinse and repeat until they're dead. I know when I boil boss fights down to the most purest form, it can be applied to literally every boss fight ever, but Resident Evils were that simple that I wasn't engaged and just started thinking about them mechanically. And I think what made me feel this way is because they're not hard and they're not interesting. I know it's probably because of the limitations of the hardware and the fact this is the first entry in the whole series, but all the bosses just do the same thing. Move around a bit, hit you, move around a bit, hit you. The only boss I felt any kind of challenge with was the final form of the Tyrant, and that was only because he moved pretty fast. Even so, I killed him on my first try. The real threat from the boss fights doesn't come from the bosses themselves, but from using a large amount of bullets or health items. Bosses are a great way to waste all of those resources you've been saving up. Besides that, they just don't feel too threatening. Again, I don't think they're bad, they do the job they set out to do, and the Tyrant and Yawn are iconic enemies. I just thought, considering the danger throughout the rest of the game, the bosses would be like the epitome of that. And visually as well, the bosses are also hit and miss. The only boss design I truly liked were the Tyrant and the second phase of Yawn, because he's all rotten and injured from the first fight. They both look really cool and unique, but the rest are just boring in my opinion. A giant plant and a giant spider, and you already know how I feel about big spiders. Still, it was very early days, and some of these boss designs stood the test of time and became icons of the Resident Evil franchise, so it's not all bad. One area of the gameplay that I thought deserved its own section, and because I'm shit at writing these reviews and couldn't figure out how to put them in without making it jarring as fuck, are the differences between Jill and Chris's campaign. You see, when you start the game, you pick between either character. Do you want the burly muscle man who comes cool, or the woman who is literally better at everything in every way? They don't differ greatly in terms of the main story of what you'll actually be doing throughout the game, but they differ enough to make playing both worth the effort. So let me talk about these differences first. So the first one is Chris is considered as hard mode while Jill is considered as easy. And there are several factors that emphasize this, and the first is inventory size. Jill has 8 inventory slots while Chris has 6. A difference of 2 inventory slots may not seem like much, but this completely changed the game. Not only can Jill carry more puzzle pieces, but more importantly, she can carry more weapons, ammo, and health. When I was playing Jill's campaign, I was comfortable with the inventory space, because I had just enough to make sure the game was challenging, but not too restrictive. With Chris though, I would sit on the item box screen for minutes at a time, trying to figure out what I could take and what I could leave behind, while leaving room for potential items that I may find on my journey. What makes this a harder juggling act is because Jill is the
master of unlocking.
She can use lockpicks to unlock some doors or drawers that usually contain useful items. Chris is no master of unlocking, so he has to find these small keys to unlock the same things Jill can unlock, but just based on sheer talent. That means you have another inventory slot taken up by a key in Chris's campaign. If you don't find these keys, you can miss out on some resources that can make your experience a lot easier. And while we're on the topic of keys, Chris has a sword key in the campaign while Jill doesn't. That means Chris has to unlock more doors in the mansion with a specific key. Again, this makes Chris's campaign harder because there is another factor you need to think about while juggling his inventory. A reduced inventory also increases how often I was backtracking while playing as Chris, which may seem annoying, but it also increases the tension of the game because you are always in danger more often. I believe this is the main reason why Chris's campaign is harder, but he does have something that makes the game a bit easier compared to Jill. Chris can take more damage, which means the danger of constantly backtracking is somewhat balanced, which is nice because there are so many things stacked against Chris. Each character has unique companions that join them on their adventure, and these companions can also play into the difference in difficulty. Jill has the always handsome and beautiful Barry Burton by her side. He's a really cool dude who helps out in some dire situations, but also gives Jill a rocket launcher just out of fucking nowhere. He also leaves her resources from time to time. Chris has Rebecca, who isn't as helpful. She does help out in some puzzles, but in a different way, which I will get into later. later. She can also heal Chris at one point, but that's about it really. Barry really helps Jill out throughout the entirety of her campaign, and it really reduces the game's challenge, while Chris has to fight for himself most of the time. I do like this as it makes Chris's campaign a much more tenser and lonelier experience. But one of the biggest differences is seen in the puzzles. Though the puzzles tend to be the same in terms of their solution, the execution is different. Or a puzzle will need to be actually solved when previously a companion would help out. That's vague, so let me explain. At one point in the game, Barry saves Jill's life when a roof is about to crush her because she took a shotgun off a wall. When Chris enters this room with a shotgun, he must replace it with a broken one, otherwise he will become a Chris version of some sort of wheat-based food item. I like this as it flips the expectation of the player when they go through both campaigns and emphasizes their differences. But examples such as this are few and far between, and instead, the changes tend to become more tedious and interesting. As I said before, Jill is an extremely capable and talented STARS member who has a basic education. Chris is an absolute idiot. The best example of this is the V-Jolt puzzle I mentioned earlier. You see, Jill knows basic math, which she uses to solve the V-Jolt puzzle all by herself. Chris sees numbers and thinks they're letters and can't even read the numbers until he finds a book that spells out the puzzle for him. There are several other puzzles that follow a similar format. Jill can do something or know something and Chris doesn't. The worst example of this is the difference that occurs when the player needs to get the shield crest from the music room. The puzzle involves the player needing to find musical notes to play a piano that will open a wall which reveals a crest. Both of the puzzles are the same up to this point, but here is where they diverge. For Jill, it's pretty easy. Since she is the best, she knows how to read music and can just play the song all by herself. Chris can't read music and must get Rebecca to help. So far, not bad. It's a difference, but not an annoying one. But here is where the changes become completely pointless. Rebecca must practice first because she hasn't played piano in a while, okay? I waited in the room listening to her play it, but she could never get it right. You want to know how you trigger her to play the song correctly? You have to walk back to the main hall, which honestly isn't far, and then walk back to the music room. After that, she knows how to play the song and the wall opens. This feels like a pretty pointless change just to make Chris's campaign more tedious and come across as difficult. I think that's the best way to describe some of these differences. Tedious. I appreciate the developers went to the efforts to make the campaigns different from one another, but they are usually done in a way that just makes the player do something pointless just to get the same result. If there were more puzzle pieces to collect or maybe a curveball thrown in, I think the differences would have served more of a purpose. Also, these puzzle differences and stuff, they just disappear after the player completes the guardhouse, which is about 2 hours into the game. I wish there was more of this mechanic and extended throughout the entirety of the game. It just makes playing Chris's campaign a mostly slower experience as opposed to a harder one. Now I've finally got through all of the gameplay shenanigans, let's talk about the environment. The environments in Resident Evil are widely regarded as some of the most iconic areas in any video game, and for good reason. As soon as I booted up the game and entered the Spencer Mansion, I immediately got the feeling that something wasn't right. Any mansion built by a rich white person is full of deep dark secrets, and this one made me feel the same. It is sprawling with numerous rooms, most of which are hidden behind locked doors, spiraling hallways, and 2 floors that connect and loop back to one another. Each area has a distinct feeling and artistic design that differentiates them, which also makes creating a mental map of the sprawling mansion a lot easier. The mansion holds up pretty well graphically thanks to pre-rendered backgrounds, but I did have some problems with them. Most of the connecting areas just look very plain. Now I know I just previously said the design of each location helped differentiate them all, and that is true, but how I differentiated them was purely based on the color. Here is an example of my thought process when exploring the mansion. Okay, I need to go through the main hall with the shitty carpet to get to the red hallway with the green door to find the cream area with the save room. Rooms themselves featured unique and interesting decor, but the areas between them were kinda disappointing. Also, the mansion isn't very spooky. The main reason why I felt this way was because the mansion was so well lit. I would hate to see the owner's electricity bill, to be honest. The bright lighting just takes away from the overall atmosphere of the game. Nothing is hidden and everything is visible. In terms of actual level design, the mansion is the most complicated area of Resident Evil and the place you will be spending most of your time. It requires the most keys to unlock doors and has the most puzzles to solve. At first, it is very daunting. Having to remember where certain locked doors are or puzzle pieces are really adds to the feeling that you are exploring this giant location. When I first started wandering around the mansion, it was quite overwhelming. It seemed like there were so many options and I could easily get lost. As I progressed through though, finding more keys to unlock more areas and becoming more accustomed to its layout through backtracking, I felt like I overcame one of the biggest hurdles in my gaming experience. Unfortunately, the other areas in Resident Evil don't really live up to the expectations expectations set by the mansion. Unlike the sprawling hallways and dense areas of the mansion, the rest of the areas are basically small, straight lines or a box with very little to make them interesting or memorable. Usually it's just a hallway of rooms at the side, and most of them don't have numerous levels, and if they do, there is not much to actually see or do. They don't really require you to make a mental map because there are so few areas to explore, or they are bunched close together. I didn't feel lost or overwhelmed in the areas after the mansion, which took away one of the things that made playing Resident Evil a tense experience. I really wish the areas in the rest of the game were maybe condensed down into a single large location like the mansion, so the game would continue making me feel overwhelmed, or at least not make the other areas a straight line or a box. I'm keen to see whether the later games in this series fall into the same trap. I really hope not, because everything outside of the mansion was one of the things that disappointed me the most. But I can't underestimate how fucking cool the mansion is. And now we get on to the music. It is good when it goes into your ears, and I think the music is one of the most important aspects of a survival horror game in regards to creating its atmosphere. And I'm happy to report that the music in Resident Evil is one of my favourite things about it. Luckily, the version of the director's cut I played didn't have the new soundtrack, which contained classic songs such as this. I'm not well versed in discussing music. My best contribution is the instruments sound good when they're played that way, so I tend to analyze music based on how it makes me feel. What I like about the music in Resident Evil is that it's atmospheric, tense, but also catchy as hell. There is a good mixture of ambient sounds, guitar and piano that manage to fit well into the background and create a foreboding, oppressive mood, while also being distinctive enough so they are memorable. When I streamed the game on my Twitch channel, I found myself humming along to the songs. The obvious highlight is the safe room music, which perfectly encapsulates what I just said. It relaxes the player and tells them that for now, they're safe. While other tracks instill a feeling of danger. I previously mentioned the redone soundtrack for later releases and how bad it was, but it just proves how good the original music was and how important a good soundtrack is to a horror game. It really added to that overall experience, and when it was changed, it also changed the atmosphere of the game itself. Which is fair, because the new soundtrack sounds like hearing your parents have sex. You really don't want to hear it, but no matter what you do, you can't escape the awful sounds that will probably scar you for life. So after all that nonsense, basically, I'm really glad I gave Resident Evil a second chance because I fell in love with it. My use of a guide and dismissive opinions about the game was stopping me from enjoying one of the most classic survival horror games of all time. Even 20 years after its release, the game still holds up in most areas. Sure, visually it is aged and the voice acting and some of the puzzles are horrendous, but even at its worst, Resident Evil is a classic survival horror game. If you are like me and for whatever reason didn't like this game when you first tried it, I urge you to give it a second chance. The gameplay is still incredibly tense, the stress from managing your inventory and finite resources is fantastic, and its unforgiving nature makes it a truly terrifying experience. I cannot wait to dive into the other classic Resident Evil titles. I can officially say I am a fan of Resident Evil, though I still think Resident Evil 6 is a fantastic game and you can at me.
You don't suppose I think I can fly a plane, do you?
Wait! Don't shoot!
Get down!
There are a few games that garner as much respect and appreciation as Resident Evil 2. Released in 1998, this game was obviously the sequel to the original Resident Evil, hence the 2 at the end. Upon its release, it blew away players and critics alike and received amazing reviews all around. It was one of the must-have games on the PlayStation and solidified Capcom as the kings of survival horror. Well, that was until Silent Hill came around and took that crown, but hey, that's just my opinion, and it's the truth. I was 6 when this game came out, so I didn't get the chance to play it at the time. But I remember watching a family friend play it when I visited their house, and it terrified me. I was witnessing one of the scariest things I had ever seen in my scant 6 years on this earth. Much like the original Resident Evil though, I never went back as a teenager or even as an adult to play it. As I mentioned in my review of Resident Evil 1, which is linked in the description, I wasn't a fan of Capcom's take on survival horror. After I reviewed the first game and found myself absolutely loving it, I knew I had to play the sequel for the very first time. Just an FYI, you should probably watch my review of Resident Evil 1, as this is a continuation of that review, and stuff I mentioned there, I don't really go into detail here if those things haven't changed too much. But after all the hype over the years, will I find it amazing? Or will Resident Evil 2 not live up to my expectations? Well, you gotta watch this video to find out, so let's go.
Resident Evil 2.
Resident Evil 2 takes place in Raccoon City, 2 months after the events of the original game. 2 sexy people are making their way to the city. One is Leon S. Kennedy, who was a police officer on his first day on the job, and Claire Redfield, sister of big boy Chris. She has come to town to look for her brother. He seems to have disappeared shortly after he made it out of the Spencer mansion. As the pair get to the city, they both find it has been overrun by zombies. These zombies have been created by the T-virus, which somehow leaked into the town's water supply. They run into each other and decide to team up, steal a cop car, and make their way to the police station. But while they are driving, Leon's zombie twin appears from the back seat and starts to attack. They collide with a wall and destroy their car, but killing the zombie in the process. Before they even get a chance to catch their breath, a truck being driven by a zombie is hauling ass down the road and is about to make the pair a
Jill sandwich.
They dive out of their respective sides of the car and the truck goes smash and then goes bang. Now separated, they stick to their plan and decide to meet up at the police station. Claire finds out that Chris is actually in Europe on some secret soldier shit. And I realise that if Chris had just picked up his phone, his sister wouldn't have come to a city infested with zombies and monsters. Leon and Claire realise that the city is truly fucked and they should search for survivors separately and escape. I don't know why they just don't fucking stick together, but then I guess the game wouldn't happen, so whatever. Claire runs into a little girl named Sherry Birkin, who is on the run from an unknown creature who seems to be specifically after her. Leon encounters Ada Wong, who claims she is in town to look for her boyfriend John, who worked as an Umbrella researcher, but Ada seems to know more than she is letting on. But as Claire and Leon try to escape, they slowly uncover the secrets of Umbrella, its ties to Raccoon City, and what the pharmaceutical company has been working on in the shadows. It is up to them to make sure what happened in Raccoon City doesn't happen again, while also escaping the infested city with their lives. The story in Resident Evil 2 feels like it was the first time the series really found its identity. Sure, the whole outbreak, shady company doing evil experiments and 2 people sorting that shit out was in the first game, but this is where these ideas really became their own, were properly fleshed out and identifiably Resident Evil. Setting the sequel in Raccoon City was a genius move, as it showed how truly devastating the T-virus is when exposed to a populace, instead of within the confines of a mansion, while also upping the ante from the previous game. This also emphasized just how evil the Umbrella Corporation were. The sign outside of Raccoon City states it's the home of the Umbrella Corporation, and having that home infected and destroyed reflects how the shady organization brought this onto themselves, and anything they touch will inevitably be destroyed. Alongside this, the motivations of some of the more naughty characters reflects again how evil Umbrella is, but also how the company has control over those in power. The outbreak shows how those in power will do whatever they can to benefit themselves, even if it hurts those they are supposed to protect, and just how deep Umbrella has its claws in the world. The whole plot is more blockbuster movie than a creepy horror film. An obvious comparison would be between Alien and Aliens. Alien is Resident Evil 1, slow, methodical, unsettling, while Resident Evil 2 is Aliens. Still keeps the core of the original, but increases the intensity and makes it more bombastic. There is so much more going on in Resident Evil 2. So many players in the plot who each have their own backstory and motivations, and multiple threads that further develop and expand everything that has happened before and will occur in the future. Most of the necessary story is shown through cutscenes and character interactions, but much more is fleshed out in the notes found throughout the game. These really dive into the history of Raccoon City, its politics, and the big players, but also dives into individual characters' backstories and their motivations. It also gives Umbrella its time to shine, as the notes explain the experiments occurring, all the backstabbing and shady shit the employees are doing, and just really emphasizes how evil they are. Every possible avenue of the world of Resident Evil is covered and provides the player with more information. It really makes the world feel like a real place, which makes it more heartbreaking when you see the actions of the few destroying the many. One massive area the story has improved is through the cutscenes. Remember those full motion cutscenes in Resident Evil 1 I didn't talk about too much but are beyond a meme at this point? Well, Capcom seemed to realise either they were complete trash or getting a bunch of people together and filming them in costumes on a real set wasn't worth the effort for Resident Evil 2. So now it features CGI cutscenes. Though I would have loved to see FMV cutscenes in Resident Evil 2 just to see how silly the intro and outro would get, but honestly the game is way better for it. The main reason why I think they are better is because they allow me to take them more seriously. Who here actually thought the live action cutscenes in the original did the job of introducing the player to the world and conveying the horror and chaos of that game effectively? Or do you just remember the memes? So when I booted up this game and saw the new cutscenes, I thought, oh shit, Capcom is taking the story seriously now. Cool, I guess I will too. I don't doubt seriousness and scares were the intention behind the FMVs in the original, but I am glad Capcom corrected that mistake to make the introduction of the game more engaging and less comedic. The CGI cutscenes also allowed the devs to show stuff they could not afford to do if it was live action. Mainly the whole scene where Leon's zombie twin attacks the pair in the police car and all the bullshit that ensues after that. Capcom would have needed to fork out some serious money to film that in live action. But the line delivery is still a bit weird and off. One line that comes to mind is when Leon gives Claire a gun.
There's a gun inside.
Better take it with you.
But these are nothing compared to...
No! Don't go!
This could be blamed on other games of the time still getting the hang of the whole recording speech thing, or the game could really be going all in on the B-movie vibes the series is known for. Either way, I just wanted to point it out because I'm petty, but the voice delivery isn't abhorrently terrible. I am really glad Capcom made this change because I doubt anyone could convince me the story in these games was serious based off... The characters also feel like actual characters in Resident Evil 2 as opposed to planks of wood who struggle to say words in a way that didn't come across like they were robots. Claire is easily my favourite of the two. She is a caring and empathetic person who will do whatever it takes to help others. But she isn't afraid to call someone out on their shit either, and will stand her ground when she believes in something or wants to protect someone. She also acts as a mother figure to Sherry, as her biological mother is, well, busy.
Oh my. Hold on, darling. I'm taking care of that bullet wound first. Stay here.
Thank God for my reefer, man. This shit good.
The dynamic between her and Sherry shows Claire's softer side, while her encounters with everyone and everything else in the game shows how tough and determined she is. Leon, on the other hand, is a lovable buffoon who wants everyone to take him seriously. He is a rookie cop in a new town, and even though some shit is figuratively, and probably literally in some cases, hit the fan, he still tries to be a police officer. He still believes law and order needs to remain in chaos, but also he believes officers are someone you can trust, and also offers safety and reassurance. That is, at least in the world of Resident Evil. So he tries to convey that when he meets others. This whole cop shtick usually gets him made fun of by other characters, as they believe his whole ideology doesn't really gel well with the whole zombie outbreak society falling apart thing. You can't really arrest and prosecute a zombie. Even though this happens, he doesn't buckle, and tries his best to do his job because he may be the last cop in the city, and to Leon, that means something. It is his responsibility to look after others, and he owes that to his comrades and to himself. The fact that I had such a takeaway from these characters shows how much the writing and character development improved from the original to the sequel. Though Jill and Chris are iconic characters, they really became the characters we know from their actions in later titles. They were just memes in the original. On the other hand, Claire and Leon filled their iconic roles from their first appearance in this game, because the writers took the time to flesh them out and make them actual characters. And even though I roasted it a bit before, the voice acting has greatly improved as well. Lines still come across as stiff and weird sometimes, but the vast majority are actually good and when needed, convey the appropriate emotions. I'm glad Capcom didn't dive into the whole shit voice acting like in the first game, and decided to really focus on improving it, because I believe it is one of the biggest reasons why I enjoy the characters and could take them and the story itself seriously. Overall, the plot, the characters, all that jazz is a major improvement, and I absolutely loved it. You're not going to get the Citizen Kane of zombie games, but you are going to have a fun and sometimes emotional time, and you will get to experience the moment when Resident Evil truly became Resident Evil. The gameplay in Resident Evil 2 hasn't changed too much since the original game, but it has been more refined and perfected. That just shows how good the original game was at doing the whole survival horror thing, when slight tweaks feel like massive improvements. You still have tank controls, fixed camera angles, inventory management, limited saves. It's all there. I'm not going to go way deep into that stuff because I would just be repeating myself, so if you want to hear me talk about those things in more depth, you should check out my review of the original Resident Evil. It will be in the description. However, I will talk about how Resident Evil 2 has improved those mechanics over the original. So straight away, the tank controls feel a lot better when compared to the original. I haven't done any research or have any information to back this claim up, so take this with a grain of salt, but running around and doing shit in Resident Evil 2 just feels a lot tighter and smoother. Not in a way that makes the controls massively easier compared to the original, but it feels like they've just been refined while keeping the tension that comes with a tank control scheme. There has been one small life improvement made for Resident Evil 2 that I love so much that I would have babies with it, and I don't want kids. That is the new map. Fuck, I love this thing. It is more detailed compared to the original map, but it actually displays which doors are locked and what keys they need. This shit is enough for this game to get a score of out of 10. It made identifying locked doors so much easier, as Resident Evil 1's map didn't tell you shit besides, yo, you're in this room, and that was fucking it. Another change I can no longer live without is the ability to swap grenade rounds from the grenade launcher by combining other ammo types with the weapon. This is beautiful, and I want to kiss the person who thought of this. Having to use up whatever ammo was left in the grenade launcher before I was able to swap ammo types was something I didn't agree with in the original game, and I don't know why the developers wanted to hurt me so bad. So I'm glad to see the sequel realize how stupid that was and fixed it. But one of the biggest changes is there is no difference in inventory sizes between the two characters. Both Leon and Claire have 8 slots, whereas Chris had 6 while Jill had 8 in the original. This was done in Resident Evil 1 to provide significant gameplay and difficulty differences between the two STARS members, but Resident Evil 2 puts both characters on the same playing field, so you can jump into either one without being forced to have a tougher experience. The player can also find an item that expands the inventory further. The side pack found in the police station adds 2 more slots for a total of 10. Such a large inventory space may seem counterintuitive to the idea of item management, which is at the core of survival horror, but that is because of one big reason. That big reason is Resident Evil 2 was the series' first step into a more action-focused experience. It isn't balls to the wall action like Resident Evil 6, but the game definitely started flirting with the idea. From the get-go, you can see a clear contrast between the original and the sequel. In Resident Evil 1, the first moments the player got to control the character were pretty chill. It allowed the player to become accustomed with the game while getting that story going and added some of that sweet and sexy tension. But Resident Evil 2 on the other hand is like, bitch run, shit is on fire, zombies are everywhere, look at all the dead bodies and chaos, don't just stand there motherfucker, kick those foot Ferraris into gear and move! This game ain't fucking around and the rest follows suit. Unlike the first game where you would encounter like a max of 3 enemies at once, and don't quote me on this by the way, but in Resident Evil 2 you can run into 7 or more enemies in one screen or one area. And the new enemies, which I will get into later, also feel designed for a more action focused title throughout their movement abilities and attacks alongside their increase in numbers. The setting of an apocalyptic city and a police station also feel ripped straight out of an action film. The game overall is larger and grander and has the feeling of a blockbuster movie, which is way different compared to the foreboding and isolating atmosphere of the original game. That is not me saying this game is any less survival horror or tense. The game does slow down and goes back into being the spooky shit we know and love, but it just takes a different route while maintaining the fundamental philosophies of the survival horror genre. As I mentioned before, the inventory has also been tweaked to accommodate for a more action-focused title, hence why there are now 8 to 10 inventory slots. Because you are forced to face off against more enemies, you are going to need more weapons, ammo, healing items, and saves. The game gives the player these extra resources, so the inventory is expanded to allow that, but it is also balanced. You are not going to be walking around packed with ammo and healing items. Because you will need more stuff regularly, your inventory can and will get full pretty quickly, and because you may be using more resources, you will also run out of them quicker. This small tweak allows the game to remain a bit more action focused while also not taking away the inventory and resource management this series is known for. The only negative I can think of with this change is ink ribbons are abundant. I never felt like the game put me in a situation where I couldn't save, or where I ran the risk of replaying large chunks of the game if I died. I had ink ribbons coming out of every hole in my body, and yes, every hole. So some of the tension created from that mechanic was lost, but I don't think it took away from the overall experience. The combat has also been streamlined to accommodate this change. No major differences but slight tweaks. You get more guns and also have the ability to upgrade some or load them up with different ammo types, which can be handy against certain enemies. Auto aim is now included in the game, so I wrote hooting in the fucking script, but shooting. So auto aim is now included in the game, so shooting monsters made by evil scientists just feels better and gives the player more options to combat the large amount of and wider array of enemies. Without auto aim, the combat would be super frustrating, so luckily the the devs knew that, and with their more actiony game, they knew to include it. Somehow this game just manages to be a compelling survival horror and action game. This balance is pulled off fucking perfectly, and it never felt too focused in one direction, which is something that would plague the series later on. This wouldn't be possible if the pacing was terrible, but it is, as I said before, fucking perfect. Both action and survival horror complement each other. It gives the player the tension and catharsis all in one game, and that is hard to pull off, but Capcom did it, and they did it, as I said before, and before that, and probably before that, fucking perfectly. There are also some pretty big differences depending on which character you choose. This is made evident when the player enters Kendo's gun shop in the first 5 minutes of the game. In Claire's campaign, Kendo was holding a crossbow, a weapon I have never used, but hey, it's there. While in Leon's campaign, Kendo was holding a shotgun, and the player can grab either of those weapons after, well... These weapon differences carry throughout the entire game and really change how I approach each character's campaign. For Claire, she gets to have a grenade launcher with a variety of ammo types such as grenade, obviously, fire, and acid. Each of these grenade types are devastating, but some work better on certain enemies. You can never go wrong with acid rounds though, so that's just a little hint from me to you. Leon, on the other hand, doesn't get the grenade launcher. Instead, he gets the beautiful shotgun and the Magnum, which is a devastating weapon, but ammo for it is somewhat scarce, so it's best saved for bosses. Since Leon doesn't get access to the gorgeous grenade launcher and its multiple ammo types, Leon can get upgrades for his weapons. This is a really good addition. One upgrade can make the pistol fire 3 bullets at once, while another increases the damage and spread of the shotgun. The Magnum upgrades just makes the Magnum blow things to pieces more effectively. Unlike Claire's campaign, where the grenade launcher would be the player's primary weapon, Leon's campaign encourages the player to really mix up what weapons they are using in combat. I found myself using the pistol more in Leon's campaign while saving the shotgun and Magnum for specific moments. While playing as Claire, I mainly stuck with a grenade launcher because its different ammo types were good enough for nearly every combat situation. I only used the pistol if I was low on grenade rounds or if there was just a single zombie, but that rarely happens as the game was quite generous at times. The last equipment difference is Leon has a lighter while Claire has a lockpick, which was pulled from the original Resident Evil, and it works the exact same way. Claire can unlock drawers and cupboards to get some extra ammo, health items, ink ribbons, and all that stuff. Leon can do the same, but he needs to find small keys to unlock the same drawers and cupboards. But I won't go too much into detail about those mechanics since they are basically exactly the same from Resident Evil 1, so yep, they work the same. The reasons why I enjoy the characters having different loadouts is because it makes each of the characters feel like their own person with unique playstyles and combat options or specialties, and this is done purely through the game's mechanics. One character isn't unnecessarily harder, both are just unique, and that is some damn good game design right there. But are you ready for an abrupt change of topic? You can play as other characters throughout both Leon and Claire's campaign. I didn't know where to put this, so I decided to break the flow of this review and just shove it right here. Please like and subscribe for more high quality content. In Resident Evil 1 during Chris's campaign, there was a small section where you got to play as Rebecca. It wasn't anything amazing, but it was a nice inclusion. Resident Evil 2 simultaneously expands this idea while also doing nothing with it. In Leon's campaign, there are sections where you play as Ada, and in Claire's you get to play as Sherry. Though I like this initially, once I realized that all you do is just run from one section to another, grab something and run back, and in fact, most of the sections where you play as the other characters are exactly the same, doesn't matter really what campaign you're playing at the time. I was pretty disappointed with them. They do give some new perspectives when these characters encounter other characters, but that is really about the only positive I have for these parts. Another issue is that these sections offer no challenge. You will run into some enemies, but they are never really a threat, especially if you're playing as Sherry. She can't be grabbed by a zombie. I am assuming it's because her character model is so small, and Capcom didn't want to animate the zombies crouching down to get her. Also, watching a kid get munched on by a zombie would be pretty full on. So all they do is spit what I think is acid on you, and this acid is so easy to dodge that it was basically a non-issue. Upon multiple playthroughs, I just blitzed past these parts so I could get back to playing as either Leon or Claire. I'm okay with them being here, I just wish they offered some unique gameplay mechanics specific to a character, or were at least somewhat challenging. Instead, it's just a race to the item you need so you can continue playing the actual game. Now on to the enemies. Most of the creepy crawlies make a return in Resident Evil 2, but with some new additions to really mix things up. First up are the obvious, zombies. They are back and they look so much better than their Spencer Mansion counterparts. Their models are just much more detailed and varied. You will see zombies that are civilians while others are police officers. There are even female zombies now, so it is good to see the T-Virus is progressive. Umbrella, we hate you all. and we want you to all die. You can see in great detail the clothes they are wearing and the wounds they suffered, which turned them into the undead. You will see some repeating models, but that didn't bother me too much. I just like how the zombies feel more distinct and detailed, as I think that makes them more intimidating. In Resident Evil 1, they were just dudes in green shirts or lab coats. Or they were naked? How did this happen? The dogs, spiders, and crows make an appearance as well, but they only pop up in about 2 or more areas. I have always hated the dogs in Resident Evil, mainly because I am terrible at dodging them, so I'm happy they aren't in this game too much. But when they do appear, they are usually in tight corridors, so you know your boy took some damage and wasted some herbs. The crows are not a threat and only appear in one hallway, I think. You can easily run past them, and the only way they'll hurt you is if you accidentally run into a wall or something. But still, this hallway was pretty intimidating because I was always scared they were just gonna get me at some point. There are these plant-like enemies you encounter later in the game as well. They aren't really dangerous, and if you have some flame rounds or a flamethrower, you can take them out no problem. Just don't let them spit on you because you will get poisoned. These guys are really underutilized and only appear near the end of the game for a little bit, and then that's it. I guess they are there for variety? I don't know. The spiders appear in the sewers, and just like the crows, they aren't really a threat either. The only threatening thing about them is that they spit on you. But they only happened to me once in all of my 4 playthroughs of this game, and I had to run past them loads of times. Even if they do poison you, the devs put blue herbs nearby, so you aren't really in that much trouble. But they do scare the shit out of me though. I really don't like spiders, and seeing these large fucking things running towards me gives me the creeps. Hunters do not make an appearance this time around, and thank God for that, because I always get fucking killed by them. But they have been replaced with the iconic licker. They first make an appearance when you are casually walking into another room and you see one dart across a window. Pretty spooky. Then, in an awesome cutscene, you see one crawling on the roof, pull out a tongue that would make Gene Simmons jealous, and drop onto the ground right in front of the player. These fuckers are tough. They move really fast, can walk on the ceiling, love jumping around, and can use their enormous tongue for some long-range attacks. Basically, these dudes have every front covered. Dealing with one is pretty easy, and if you have the necessary equipment handy, but sometimes you will run into a group of lickers, and this can quickly lead to the "you're dead" screen. But they do have one major weakness: they are blind. So you can avoid getting attacked by them if you just slow down and walk past them quietly. This can be pretty difficult in tight corridors, or when there is broken glass on the ground, which if you walk on, it will alert them. But I love that an enemy in this game can be approached differently instead of either fighting them or just sprinting past them. I wish more enemies were like this. Lickers are easily the standout enemy in the game. They are fast, dangerous, and their designs are so damn cool. They look slimy and gross, which makes them a bit more creepy. I don't know, just wet things unsettle me. There is a reason why the licker has become so iconic, and that is because they look so fucking badass and their tongues just make them super unsettling and creepy. There is only one more enemy I want to talk about that only appears in Scenario B. That is the trenchcoat wearing, fedora tipping milady himself, Mr. X. He is a big dude that towers over the player and appears in several scripted moments throughout the game. Even though his appearance is scripted, the player never knows which moments he will actually rock up in during their first playthrough. The big guy can hit pretty hard, but he's also pretty slow and his attacks have a long wind up. So he is pretty damn easy to dodge and run away from. And this is where I get into my major problem with him. Mr. X isn't really a threat. He is super easy to avoid, and if you run into another room, he doesn't chase you. He just gives up. But if you want to fight him, the game gives you more than enough resources to deal with him, but if you do kill him, you will get some bonuses, so yay. But honestly, I never felt the need to. Even when he popped up and surprised me, that feeling quickly went away because I knew that he wasn't a problem. If he appeared more or chased the player, I reckon he would have been way more threatening and memorable. He is just so unremarkable and forgettable that if you took him out of the game, I honestly don't think you would have lost much. But I like that Capcom introduced him only in the B scenario because they knew players would feel more comfortable in the game, so throwing in a curveball like Mr. X keeps the tension high. It's just subsequent
Why do you talk that way? I had a stroke!
It's just subsequent playthroughs that make Mr. X less of an interesting idea. Overall, I think the enemies in Resident Evil 2 are really good and they feel more fleshed out. Get it? Because zombies? All the zombie models look so much better, and the variety of models is a massive improvement over the original game. The licker is really cool and interesting. It doesn't feel out of place like mutated spiders or infected birds. It looks like a natural evolution of something exposed to the T-virus and fits in with the world the developers created. I reckon the plant monsters feel out of place though. In fact, I never understood why Capcom thought plants being infected was a good idea or even remotely scary. Unfortunately, I feel like Mr. X was a wasted opportunity. He could have been a really formidable foe that was constantly stalking the player, but he's relegated to certain moments. If the poor bastard knew how to open doors, he could have been an actual threat. But now, let's get on to the boss fights. If you watch my review of the original Resident Evil, thank you, and you know how I felt about boss fights in that game. They required nothing more from the player than to stand in a corner and shoot while occasionally moving to avoid attacks. Pretty in my opinion. Resident Evil 2 doesn't do too much to impress me, but the bosses in this game are an improvement over their counterparts in the original. Not because of how you fight them changes, but because the bosses do. The first change, and one that is an absolutely fantastic idea, is that Resident Evil 2 features a central boss dude who you fight several times in the game and is a persistent threat throughout. Each time you go toe to toe with the bro named Birkin, he will mutate, which means each fight is slightly different in terms of Birkin's attacks. The first fight may only have him walk slow and try and hit you with a pipe, while the second fight will have him move really fast and hit really hard with a massive claw that he has. These changes make fighting the same guy several times feel fresh and unpredictable. Sure, you will still just be sitting there in a corner and shooting, which is still pretty in my opinion, but these fights require a bit more engagement from the player. Birkin is also a key part of the overall plot and plays a major role in Claire's campaign. He feels like the antagonist of the game, and that is something that was severely lacking in the OG Resident Evil. This also makes every fight with him feel more important because the game took the time to establish him as an unstoppable threat, so when you come across him, it feels like a really intense moment. You do fight some other bosses, but they are extremely forgettable. You only ever encounter them once and they fall into the trappings of the bosses from the original game. Just real basic attacks and you don't have to think or do too much to actually beat them. To be honest, if these bosses were just removed from the game, again, nothing would change. I completely forgot what the bosses were while writing this, so I had to look them up because they were that forgettable. I know that having Birkin as the only boss could be disappointing for some, so these other monsters offer some variety, but they come at the cost of enjoyment. I would have just preferred to fight Birkin more or keep the amount of fights the same. Fights with him are more than enough to make me go, oh yeah, that's some good Resi shit right there. I didn't know how to finish that previous sentence, so that is what I went with. The B scenario mixes the bosses up a little, mainly what bosses you fight and where you fight them. If your A scenario character killed something, they may not be present in the B scenario, or a boss that was present in one location may be swapped out for another, and the final boss is completely different. I really like this, as it makes playing the different scenarios somewhat unpredictable. The player thinks they know what to expect, and this change shows the player that they are wrong. The fights themselves don't really change, but I still like this inclusion. The big problem I have with Birkin and every boss in this game is that they are so damn easy. I always had enough ammo and health items to deal with them, but most of the time, I was actually over-prepared. I demolish a boss and realize I only used a little bit of ammo and maybe one health item. The only way I could see the boss fights being more challenging without being unfair is to change them completely so both the boss and the player have more options. They are heading in the right direction, mainly due to an actual antagonist and his mutations, but they need to do more to make them actually interesting, engaging, or even the tiniest bit challenging. I don't know, maybe throw in a puzzle that needs to be solved to beat them or something in the environment that could do extra damage while saving resources. Just anything different. For what the boss fights are, they are fine, but I just wanted more from them. And just because this game is more action focused doesn't mean Resident Evil 2 lacks those quote unquote puzzles. It's just that they don't really evolve from the original in any meaningful or creative way. The player is still looking for some shit to put in shit to open shit. No puzzle really makes you use your brain because the solutions are so damn obvious. If in the rare instance that someone comes across a puzzle you find difficult, you can just brute force it until you get the answer. The best example of this is the puzzle where you have to light these things on the wall in a specific order. I never read a note about this puzzle, and to be honest, I don't know if there is one. So instead of looking around the police station to locate some sort of hint for this puzzle, I just did the process of elimination and knocked off the possible combinations until it worked. This is pretty disappointing. There is one big problem with the puzzles that even the most diehard fans find to be pretty silly, and that's the fact that these types of puzzles even exist in the setting of Resident Evil 2. The game does try to explain it by saying the police station was previously an art gallery, but that doesn't hold up. What art gallery has Capcom been to where the key for a locked door is hidden inside the urn of a statue that can only be grabbed once someone gets a unicorn medal and shoves it under this statue? It sounds like any sort of evacuation would be a pain in the ass. No wonder everyone in the fucking police station died. In the Spencer mansion, it felt more believable because the mansion was designed to be confusing and hard to navigate because a shady corporation was doing shady experiments. But the same philosophy doesn't quite work when the environments don't fit. Even though I just ranted about this, to be honest, I don't really care that these puzzles exist and don't fit into the new environments. Because these kinds of puzzles are one of the main gameplay aspects of this series. No matter where a Resident Evil game is set, this is the type of shit we as a player are going to be doing. I have just accepted that the world of Resident Evil has really elaborate and creative architects who enjoy shoving things in things and making those things hard to find. I don't need a lore explanation for everything when I'm playing a game where zombies, giant spiders, and four-legged monsters with big old tongues are trying to kill me. But there has been one major improvement in the puzzles of Resident Evil 2 compared to the original. There are way less block puzzles! I think there are only 3 block puzzles in the entire game, and they aren't as slow and annoying as this fucking thing. I would vastly prefer if there were no block puzzles because they bring the game's pacing down to a crawl, but deciding to have less is a fucking win in my books. But if you plan on doing both scenarios, you will be pushing these boxes a lot, so just be prepared for that. The way we are going, there could be no block puzzles in Resident Evil 3, so if so, that is my favourite game in the series purely based on that. I wish the puzzles required more from the player, and since this game is action focused and encourages multiple playthroughs, I understand why they are pretty simple. It is to keep the pacing flowing and not have any major slowdowns or roadblocks. The game is constantly leading the player from one place to another, from one set piece to the next story development, and I am a massive fan of that. Having to sit there and fuck around with a puzzle would kind of ruin that awesome pacing. Well, I hope that this is the reason why the puzzles are the way that they are, but at this point I'm just accepting that Resident Evil doesn't have good puzzles. But now I want to talk about one of the biggest changes in Resident Evil 2, and that is it introduces something extremely cool and makes replaying the game not only enjoyable, but necessary to get the full experience. I am of course talking about the zapping system. You gain access to this system after completing the A scenario of any character. Once this is done, a new save file will appear for the other character labelled B scenario. Actions done in the A scenario will affect events in the B scenario. For example, if you take the S machine gun and side pack, which expands your inventory in the A scenario, they will not be available for the other character in the B scenario. Or if you kill the alligator in the sewer in A, he won't appear in B as, well, he's already dead. But if you don't, he will appear in B. There are a total of 9 instances in Resident Evil 2 where the player's decisions in one scenario will affect the other. The B scenario is also different in terms of gameplay and story too. You will get slightly different cutscenes, story beats, and gameplay objectives depending on the scenario because you are playing as the other character, but in the same story, if that makes sense. Some puzzles and boss encounters will also be different, and you will get to explore some new areas. But the biggest reason to play the other scenario is to get the full story and find out what the other characters were doing while you were running around in the A scenario. And as I said before, Mr. X's appearance in the B scenario makes it unpredictable, as you never know when he'll crash through a wall and fuck up your day. Granted though, that rarely happens. This is a fantastic system for a few reasons. One is that it feels like both the characters truly exist in the world. What I mean is that in Resident Evil 1, when you played as either Chris or Jill, the other character basically didn't exist in the game until the very end. But with Resi 2, it feels like while you are playing, the other character is actually doing stuff and exists in the world, and you know that because you played as them. That is really cool. The other reason is that it greatly motivates the player to replay the game. I mean, the game basically encourages you to do this with the whole new save second scenario thing when you finish the game. It's the game's way of saying, don't you want to know what your friend was up to during this whole thing? And I'm like, yes, Resident Evil 2, I do want to know that. And seeing how your decisions will affect your second playthrough is also a good reason to jump back in. When I played this game for this video, I completed the game a total of 4 times thanks in part to the zapping system in multiple scenarios. I wanted to see how things would be different, and thankfully the game itself is that good that replaying it wasn't a burden. I think the zapping system in multiple scenarios are some of the coolest things I've ever encountered in a video game. And honestly, I can't think of any game before or since that has done this, and I don't know why. I mean, it could be super complicated to do, but I don't know, I'm not a game designer. But both these systems make replaying the game so damn fun and interesting while allowing the player to experience the story and world from different perspectives. Like fuck, I don't know how to explain how much I love this. Here, let me find a clip just to summarize it. Yeah, that works. And when you finish the game, you will get a grade. If you do good enough, you'll get some cool unlockables like guns with infinite ammo and new costumes, but the big incentive for completing the game is getting new game modes. The game features 3 minigames. The first is the Force Survivor, which is unlocked after beating both scenarios and getting an A rank on one. This canon minigame has the player controlling the ultimate badass Hunk, who must make his way from the sewer to the Raccoon City Police Department to escape via its helicopter pad. The player has a predetermined loadout and no other items are found in this mode. Another mode is unlocked by playing the game super quick and getting those sweet high-end ranks. That mode is Tofu Survivor, which is the same as the Force Survivor, but the player controls tofu. Cool. This mode is harder than the Force Survivor because society is discriminatory against sentient tofu. The last extra mode is Extreme Battle. The player gets to choose between Leon, Claire, Ada, and Boulder Boy on a European vacation, Chris Redfield, who are tasked with surviving a long gauntlet of enemies while gathering 4 antivirus bombs which will be used to make the zombies go boom boom. Much like the fourth and Tofu Survivor, the player has limited items, but unlike those modes, Extreme Battle has 3 different levels of difficulty, which makes items harder to come by, while also adding new enemies. These extra modes and unlockables really added to the overall value of Resident Evil 2. Games these days would lock all these things behind a paywall, but back in the day, you had to unlock that shit by playing the game and playing it well. Extra modes are always something I like, but the big bonus from Resident Evil 2 is that they are actually fun as well. The unlockables also add to the replay value, because who doesn't want to go through a game with a rocket launcher with unlimited ammo and absolutely destroy every monster that gave them a hard time when they first started playing? I had to find footage of this as I was nowhere near good enough to actually unlock that. This game just gives the player so many incentives to keep playing because they are constantly rewarded, and I really fucking appreciate that. I really believe unlockables are one of the forgotten cores of survival horror, and more games should have them. From the very first screen, I could tell how vastly improved the environment and graphics were over those found in the original game. The pre-rendered backgrounds are far more detailed and are an excellent means of environmental storytelling. You will run past a group of corpses sitting at a table at the start of the game. This conveys to the player that the outbreak occurred abruptly, as these people couldn't even get up from their
Succulent Chinese meal.
before getting munched on.
Get your hand off my penis!
The police station has windows barricaded, which shows what officers tried to do to prevent zombies and monsters from getting in. These examples are just 2 of so many that really flesh out Raccoon City, the surrounding areas, and details how the outbreak has destroyed these locations and the people within them. It makes them feel like real places. Like the Spencer Mansion, which, don't get me wrong, was an awesome location to explore, but the mansion only had a few moments of environmental storytelling, and the overall artistic design of the area was pretty bland, basically consisting of rooms coloured differently, while Resident Evil 2 makes every place look lived in. This also adds to the atmosphere, as seeing the horrors of the outbreak makes exploring them so damn tense, as I constantly thought whatever killed these people or destroyed this area was just around the corner and was going to do the same to me. That feeling was purely based on the environments. Also, the Spencer Mansion was so damn bright. I do think that horror can be set in well-lit locations, but that needs to be constantly thought about when the devs are working on the game so that it can add to the experience. In my opinion, that wasn't the case for the Spencer Mansion. Thankfully, Resident Evil 2's lighting is more varied. The outside is dark and spooky, while indoor areas may have lights working or they may not. The lighting makes the atmosphere thick and also differentiates areas. Some places which have not been completely taken over by the outbreak are well lit, while the opposite areas are usually dim or dark. I am so happy Capcom decided to make this change because the lighting in the original game was one of my least favourite parts of that title. The environments overall are just a fucking vast improvement and really elevated my experience and tension the game made me feel. I wanted to explore every area because I enjoyed how fleshed out and detailed they were, and that is a sign of good environmental design and environmental storytelling. The character models also received a massive improvement. For this section, I am just going to talk about playable characters and NPCs, as I'll talk about the enemies in the section where I, talk about the enemies. Leon and Claire look so much more detailed, more memorable, and look like actual people. Gone are the super blocky character models in Resident Evil 1. Now, characters have realistic proportions. Their clothing is also much more detailed. Leon's police outfit looks slick, his face looks like a face, and you can even make out the design of the RPD patch on his shoulder. Claire is the same, but instead of a patch, her iconic jacket has an awesome design on the back. Also, their outfits are altered throughout the game after certain key moments, which I thought was a cool touch. One new addition I really liked is how the characters change depending on the damage they receive. Depending on Leon and Claire's health, they will walk normally, grasp their stomach and move somewhat slower, or limp and move really slow. This was also an awesome touch, as not only does it make the damage received feel more real and have real consequences, it also is a neat way of knowing a character's state without going into the menu. you. You will also run into more characters whose designs differentiate them from each other, which makes them more memorable overall. Aesthetically and graphically, everything in Resident Evil 2 is fantastic. It seems every area visually was improved, and others which didn't really need improving were altered to make them better. Even though some might say the graphics are dated by today's standards, I think this game still looks damn good because the devs put in the effort, which has made the game age wonderfully. This section may sound different because I completely forgot to write about the level design in a video game review. I honestly question why people watch my content. Okay, so Resident Evil 2's level design. It is greatly improved upon the original game, but also falls into the same trappings once you get to the later half. First off, I'm going to talk about the police department, as it's the location where the player will spend most of their time. It follows a similar layout to the Spencer Mansion. It has an east and west wing with multiple levels which contain numerous hallways and rooms, some of which are locked behind doors that need specific keys. So far, nothing crazy that differentiates the two in terms of their basic design, but the RPD is a much better place to explore, and through its layout and environmental design, it is so much easier to make a mental map. The layout is streamlined and just makes sense. I always got lost in the Spencer Mansion, which could be a good thing as it lends to the feeling of disorientation, which can be stressful in a fun way, but I found being very lost annoying after a while because of the indistinctive nature of the Spencer Mansion, and the shitty map in that game didn't help. RE2 completely solves that problem. When I first started, I was lost and confused as I felt when I first set foot into the mansion, but after a few hours, I knew the RPD like the back of my hand. It made me feel like I had conquered a really difficult part of the game, and that feeling was super rewarding. The RPD is an awesome place to explore, and though it isn't as open-ended as the Spencer Mansion in terms of where the player can go and what they can do at what time, it more than makes up for it through its environmental storytelling and cleaner layout. Unfortunately, the rest of the areas in Resident Evil 2 fall into the same issues as the original game. In the later half of the game, the player will explore the sewers, a factory, and an umbrella lab located underneath Raccoon City. Though these locations still implement the fantastic environmental storytelling found in the police station, the game becomes a straight line to the finish once you leave the RPD. This was an issue in the original, and I found it odd that Capcom didn't fix this problem in the sequel. It's just a weird contrast. It's like the devs encourage the player to take their time, explore, and soak in the atmosphere during the first half of the game, but push the player to get to the credits as fast as they can during the second half. Thankfully, the later half of the game is still fucking awesome, so its linearity doesn't take away from the overall experience. But it could have been awesome if the level design continued to be open-ended, because exploring locations such as that is much more fun and engaging, and the thrill of conquering that puzzle is exhilarating. And it would also make subsequent replays so much more fun. I mentioned at the start I was worried this game would not live up to the hype surrounding it. Well, I didn't need to worry because I absolutely loved Resident Evil 2, and it has become one of my favourite games of all time. It lived up to and exceeded all of the hype. It provided me with the quintessential Resident Evil experience, and I am so fucking happy I finally played it. It made so many improvements and tweaked things that didn't need improving for the better. Nearly everything is just fucking better. I completely understand now why people hold this game in such high regard, because I am now one of those people. I just hope the third game improves the puzzles, the boss fights, and the linearity of the second half of the game, because I think they are the only things that hurt this series. If you are like me and you haven't played it, you need to do yourself a favor and play Resident Evil 2. And if in the past you told me to play this game and I said, nah, I don't like Resident Evil, this video is my formal apology. I should have listened. I can't wait to see what Resident Evil 3 has to offer, because I can't wait to go back to Raccoon City and re-enter the world of survival horror. Ladies and gentlemen, here it is. The final review in the classic Resident Evil game trilogy. It feels good to be done with these. This has been a monumental task for me, and I just wanted to thank everyone for supporting the channel. From the bottom of my heart, it means so much. Since this is the final review, this means we are talking about Code Veronica. Wait, no, not that. No, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. That is what we are talking about, not that other thing. Beginning these reviews 4 months ago was one of the biggest challenges for me. Tackling such an iconic franchise was at times overwhelming, but here we are. Again, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been watching these videos. These have easily been the hardest and most time-consuming videos I've ever made, and it makes me so happy you guys are enjoying them. Now with all those niceties out of the way, let's get started. Today, in this little video of mine, I'm going to be reviewing Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Released nearly 2 years after the amazing Resident Evil 2, which you can watch my review for as I will shove a link in the description. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis had a lot to live up to and expectations were astronomically high after the success of the predecessors. But with such a short time between the two games, will it live up to that hype? Well, let's find out. The story of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, which I'm just going to call Resident Evil 3 from now on because fucking it's too long of a name, is a little bit interesting as it takes place before and after the events of Resident Evil 2. The first half of the game occurs 24 hours prior to RE2, while the second half happens 2 days after. But I will just give the plot setup, early parts of the narrative, introduce the main characters and my opinions to avoid spoilers. But if you just want my opinion, firstly, thank you and you're cute, and secondly, skip to this time code. Okay, strap in. Postpone your psychologist appointment and let's go. Jill is just having the worst time. After the events of Resident Evil 1, her and her fellow STARS members reported to Chief Irons about the shenanigans that went down, but he was having none of it, and it's not because he's a shady guy. I don't know what would suggest that. As was explored in Resident Evil 2, little does Jill know that the city's rats and water supply have been infected with the T-virus, which has led to, well, this. While chilling inside her home, Jill decides she ain't got time for this and it's time to actually escape Raccoon City. After she dives out of her exploding apartment complex, she makes her way to a warehouse where she meets a lovely dude named Dario Rosso, whose mother, wife, and daughter have been turned into zombie food. Gotta say, Dario got out of a lot of responsibilities real fast. The pair chill for a day, make some small talk about their dead friends and family, but Jill soon realizes that hunkering down isn't the best idea as this is a Resident Evil game and that never works out well. She tells Dario that she's going to try and find a way out and he should tag along, but Dario doesn't want to end up like his family and has a hissy fit before running into the back of a truck. Jill's like, fuck this guy, and unlocks one of the entrances to the warehouse and begins to explore the city streets. She doesn't go back to lock the door to the warehouse again, so Dario doesn't get eaten, but Jill is a professional, so I'm sure he will be fine. As she is cruising around the destroyed streets of Raccoon City, she bumps into her STARS colleague Brad Vickers, you know, the guy that left her and her team for dead in the first game. Nice fellow, that one. Brad tells her about something that is after STARS members and they are all gonna die. He doesn't explicitly say that, but knowing this series, the team isn't being chased by a fucking Care Bear. Jill makes her way to the entrance of a familiar location, the Raccoon City Police Department, where she runs into Brad again, looking a bit scared. He tells her to run as a giant leather-wearing BDSM monster known as Nemesis appears. He grabs Brad and Resident Evil 3 turns into tentacle porn for a moment. Jill fucks around in the RPD and after she leaves, she runs into yet another person. This time it's a mercenary named Carlos Oliveira, who works for Umbrella's biohazard countermeasure service. Since he works for Umbrella and that company and Jill have a bit of a complicated history, she doesn't trust him. But after he helps her with another encounter with Hentai Boy, she reckons Carlos is a good bloke. The pair make their way to a nearby tram where Carlos's colleagues are hanging out. You got Captain Mikhail Victor, who has been injured and that's his entire character.
This looks bad.
And Sergeant Nikolai Zenoviv, who is so obviously the bad guy that he makes Nemesis look like a hero. They reveal their plan to Jill. If the mercenaries' mission were to fail, which it most certainly has at this point, they were told to escape via a helicopter which would pick them up near the clock tower. But unfortunately, they can't get there as the streets are too dangerous and the tram is no longer working. So Jill and Carlos are tasked with getting the tram up and running again so they can escape. All the while, Jill is being hunted down by Nemesis. At any moment or around any corner or in any room, he may appear and Jill must be vigilant if she wants to survive. Remember when I said in my Resident Evil 2 review where I compared the series to the Alien franchise? Basically, I said in my mouth that the original Resident Evil was like Alien while the sequel was like Aliens. Well, Resident Evil 3 is like Speed, but if Keanu Reeves was also on speed. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is an action-packed escape movie in a video game form. The plot makes the player feel a constant sense of urgency. You feel the anxiety for the escape that Jill feels. You know just as well as she does that you need to get the fuck out of Raccoon City. It's desperation manifested. And since Jill knows this, she hasn't got time for anyone's shit. She is sassy, determined, confident, and more than aware and prepared for the task at hand. Jill has grown a lot since the original game, and it is greatly reflected in her character in Resident Evil 3. Carlos is an experienced mercenary with a soft side. He is quick to trust Jill and may even have romantic feelings for her, but considering she is the only woman he has had much contact with since the zombie apocalypse started, that isn't saying much. Unless he's a necrophiliac, then in that case, he's a fat kid in a mass graveyard, who truly wants to help as many people escape, and though he technically works for Umbrella, he doesn't share any of the evil traits of those associated with that company usually have. Nikolai, on the other hand, is your typical evil Russian stereotype. I feel like every time he is by himself, he is sipping vodka in a dark room, smoking a cigar, and laughing maniacally and screaming about the motherland. That's a terrible fucking Russian impersonation, but he does have one or two interesting moments. But he just feels like somewhat of an afterthought. Like, we all know Nemesis is the main threat, but the devs felt like they also needed a human antagonist. Like, don't get me wrong though, I like how comically evil he is, and his ridiculous explanations when he's caught doing evil shit are fantastic. But I just wanted like a little bit more from him. The rest of the characters are pretty forgettable and mainly act as people to be killed later in the game, but a condensed cast means Resident Evil 3 really fleshes out Jill and Carlos, which I appreciated. But I would have also liked a more rounded and interesting cast. Unlike Resident Evil 1 and 2, there is only one playable character in Resident Evil 3, that being Jill of course. Gone are the multiple characters with their own plot lines or the zapping system. But this does mean there is now one cohesive through line in terms of plot. Also, it means the story is specifically built around Jill. It is distinctly her story. You could have featured some random new character, but I feel like this story really lets Jill become the character she is known for. You also play a brief segment as Carlos in the game, but I can't go into details about that because spoilers. But let's just say it's actually a decent idea. The developers clearly saw Resident Evil 2 in the moments where you played as a secondary character and realized that just doing this boring like block puzzle thing and just kind of going on this really predictable route was kind of just, shitty. So they actually had a whole segment dedicated to Carlos with his own unique area and all that stuff. So I kind of actually loved it. It was fun to play as Carlos. But that doesn't mean this plot doesn't try to include something new. So Resident Evil 3's addition to the branching storylines that were established in Resident Evil 2 is through two separate mechanics. The first, and probably least important but still worth mentioning, is certain story moments and character interactions can take place at different locations, thus causing them to play out somewhat differently, depending on the order in which the player explores the game. For example, in the early game, you can encounter Carlos at either the restaurant or the press office, depending on which location you go to first. At these places, Jill and Carlos will encounter Nemesis, but this encounter will play out differently because you're at a different place. Though the consequences of these moments will always be the same, this mechanic occurs a lot throughout the game and with different characters, and is a really nice touch. It adds some freshness upon multiple playthroughs. The second and probably most memorable inclusion are decisions. Throughout the game, certain set pieces will occur, such as running into Nemesis, encounters of large groups of zombies, or environmental hazards, and the player will be posed with two options, and a short time frame to choose one. Early examples range from whether or not to fight Nemesis at the police station, or choosing an escape route when Nemesis corners Jill and Carlos. Lots of the decisions revolve around Nemesis, but not all of them. Some of them can offer the player new areas to explore, items to get, or fights to fight in. You are never really punished for a decision you make, but they just offer some unique little things that can spice up repeat playthroughs. Unfortunately, besides the things I mentioned, these decisions don't have any effect on the story. Sure, certain moments might play out somewhat differently, but the core story will be unaffected. I would have preferred the decisions to have more weight, as without any sort of consequences, they just come across as being in the game for the sake of having something somewhat similar to multiple characters. It gets nowhere near to the replayability of multiple characters and barely holds a candle to the zapping system, but it is nice that the developers even included this considering the game's small development time. The overall story in Resident Evil 3 is pretty compelling and exciting. Deciding to center the plot around the escape from Raccoon City was a great idea as it really gets the adrenaline pumping and instills a sense of urgency, which is further reflected in the gameplay. I'll get to that later though. I always wanted to explore Raccoon City further when I played Resident Evil 2, and this game scratches that itch. Jill really gets her time to shine, and Carlos is a fun, albeit one-dimensional new character. Their interactions are easily the highlight of the game though. The inclusion of Nemesis as a threat is also a great addition, and perfectly expands upon the idea of an antagonist that was flirted with in Resident Evil 2. It is awesome to have this singular foe constantly hunting down Jill, and leads to some pretty great story moments, especially in the second half of the game. The other characters are just okay and aren't as fleshed out as those found in the predecessor, but they do the job they need to do and that's fine. I didn't enjoy this story quite as much as Resident Evil 2, but what is here is a fun, blockbuster romp through the streets of Raccoon City.
Why isn't someone doing something about this?
In my Resident Evil 2 review, I talked about in great detail how that gameplay started to flirt with the action genre. Well, Resident Evil 3 wants to take the action genre out to dinner, take it home, screw it and have little action babies. There are much more enemies, many more set pieces with explosions and whatnot. The whole game just feels more bombastic and chaotic, which I think perfectly reflects the apocalyptic, escape the city tone the game is going for. But that comes at the cost of the slower, atmospheric moments. They are still present, but just not nearly as much as before. Though, not all the tension is lost, and I will discuss that further when we get to the Leather Daddy. Okay, so gameplay wise, we are doing the same stuff as in previous games. All of the changes changes that were implemented in Resident Evil 2 are here and are looking as good as ever. So I won't be going over the stuff that I mentioned in my previous reviews because, you know, you can just watch them. And also, if I have to talk about that shit for a third time, I will blow my fucking brains out. So we got tank controls, fixed camera angles, item management, limited saves, blah 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 blah. Everything is here and relatively the same, but I will go over the changes. Jill has some new and unique movement additions. Some great, another not so much. Firstly, she can perform a quick 180-degree turn. This is some good shit right here. No longer do you have to turn around at the speed and breadth of a truck stuck in mud. If you want to turn around quickly, you can just do it. This just speeds up the gameplay significantly, but can also be useful if you find yourself cornered by enemies and need to face them quickly. You can now just walk upstairs without the need of pressing a button. This may seem small in the grand scheme of things, but it's just another small tweak that smooths out the gameplay and makes the world feel more connected and explorable as opposed to separate screens on a television. The one new thing that is basically useless is the dodge. If you press the shoot button at the right moment, Jill will perform a dodge. This game has a lot more enemies, some of which are very fast, so the dodge mechanic was included and you would think I would love it. But because it's mapped to the same button as shoot, and the enemy's attack animations barely have a noticeable wind up, I never actually performed a dodge on purpose. Every time I performed it, it was by a complete accident. Like, I wanted to shoot this thing, not dodge out of the way unexpectedly. You can remap the controls on PC, which is what I was playing on, but even so, the enemies just don't give you enough of a heads up to perform it, which becomes a major problem when fighting Nemesis, but I will get into that later. Another change is the implementation of objects in the environment, such as explosive barrels, lanterns, and stuff of that ilk. Player can destroy these in order to kill a large group of enemies or harm others, including Nemesis. Though nothing new in video games, their implementation in the Resident Evil franchise feels somewhat fresh. These objects are restricted to specific areas and can sometimes feel out of place, like why are there large exploding barrels littered around the streets of an American town? You know how Americans are with guns, so it seems like these are just accidents waiting to happen. But it does give the player more combat options and requires them to analyze the environment to take advantage of combat opportunities. I didn't use these too often as I tried to avoid combat, but when stuck in a tight situation, or forced into some instances via scripted events, these objects were a great way to clear a crowd of zombies. We've also got some new items and weapons to mess around with. The big new item is ammunition powder that comes in a variety of types and sizes. Depending on which ones you combine, you can make pistol rounds, shotgun rounds, and grenade rounds. The ammo crafting mechanic is pretty straightforward and has some pros and cons. The benefit is that you can craft the ammo you want, depending on whether you have the right resources, of course. So if you prefer a certain weapon or are desperate need of a specific ammo type, you have the freedom to make it. You can also create enhanced ammo, which is more powerful than the standard stuff. But where I found this to be a problem is that items in this game are randomized. So ammo, herbs, and ink ribbons are just thrown about the map, and I must have had the worst luck because I could barely find any ammunition, let alone ammo powder. In a game where the player was encouraged to kill more enemies than ever before, this was the only classic Resident Evil game where I felt like I never had any ammo. Same goes for health and ink ribbons. I was just always so low on them. That could have just been my luck or item mismanagement, but I thought I was always pretty frugal. Before, ammo and items would be meticulously placed so the player always had just enough to get by if they played right. But now this is all left up to RNG, at least I think the majority of it is. This game doesn't feel as balanced in the item department. It does keep the game somewhat fresh and unpredictable, and does emphasize the tension that comes with limited resources, but it comes at the sacrifice of a more cleaner and balanced design. The new guns are the assault rifle and the mine thrower, and some upgraded versions of the shotgun and magnum if you successfully down Nemesis in some fights with him. Basically, they work the same as their counterparts in Resident Evil 2. They shoot things better. The assault rifle though is so fucking fun to use. It feels great just to fucking gun down a large group of zombies or hunters or whatever. I loved whenever I got the chance to use this because it just felt super cathartic to unleash on these assholes. My favorite moment is when you're playing as Carlos in the hospital and this elevator door opens up and all these zombies are there and the game's just like, go on, fucking kill them all. And I did. And it was fun. But the same can't be said for the mine thrower. What even is this thing? Like, I know what it is. It launches mines that explode when enemies get close to them. But why is it in this game? Why is it in a game with fixed camera angles and pre-rendered backgrounds? I could never exactly pinpoint where I was aiming or where the mines landed, which is kind of important with a weapon that requires precise aiming. I honestly don't know why this gun is in this game, so for that reason, it remained in the item box shortly after I picked it up. Resident Evil 3 is also just a lot harder. It's the only game in the series where I died numerous times, and honestly, that was a bit refreshing. There are just so many monsters, and Nemesis is such a fucking beast that I just died and died and died and died and died. It made the enemies scary and tense again. I actually worried about dying, and that was something I haven't felt throughout the majority of my time with the Resident Evil series. It can be a bit cheap sometimes, mainly when it comes to Nemesis, but I will get into that later. But I am stoked that this game isn't a cakewalk. Oh boy, I have a sordid history with the Resident Evil puzzles. Basically, I don't think they qualify as puzzles. And in my Resident Evil 2 review, I said that I've come to accept the Resident Evil series has shitty and easy puzzles, and I thought I was done. Well, Resident Evil 3 wasn't the place I expected for the puzzles to stump me so bad, several times I might add, that I actually had to resort to looking up the answers, because I'm a big dum-dum. The standard put things in things so-called puzzles still remain in Resident Evil 3, and they haven't changed in any way, and will make up most of the puzzles in the game. But the game also includes some puzzles that involve matching an image on a screen, which is a lot harder than it sounds. Listening to two musical boxes play portions of a song to then go to a third and combine the two tunes to make a cohesive song. All this bloody head scratcher involving analyzing crystals to put in the correct time on these clocks, I still don't know how to do this. This thing stumped me and I had to look up a guide. And because the puzzles are also somewhat randomized, this took a while. But honestly, I was so happy to stumble across puzzles in this game that actually involved me to use my noggin. And I think there's only like one block puzzle, and it's super quick. I'm so happy about this. I would like to thank all my family and friends who don't watch my videos and all my subscribers who put up with my nonsense. Seriously though, these puzzles are a massive improvement over the prior two games. It feels like the devs really got out of the established ideas of what a Resi puzzle could be and did something new, and I am grateful for that. But now we're talking about the head scratch and stuff, we gotta talk about the shooty bang bang who we kill and stuff. We got a familiar cast of enemies in Resident Evil 3. Zombies, zombie dogs, crows, and spiders all make an appearance as per usual, but I won't be talking about those as they work in the same way as in previous games. Though there are so many more enemies in the game, which really lends to the feeling they are overwhelming the city, which I thought was an awesome touch and yet again further steps into the action genre. But let's talk about the new additions. First up is the Drain Demos, I think that's how you pronounce it, and Brain Sucker. The former are apparently fleas that have been affected by the T-virus. I'm assuming maybe they drank the blood of infected animals, I don't know. Anyway, these guys are big, gross looking things that want to drink blood. Same goes for the latter, but they're a bit more tougher. Drain Demos are pretty intimidating at first glance, but once you realize the trusty shotgun can take them down pretty easy, they aren't a big deal. The Brain Suckers are a bit more of a challenge, but by the time you encounter them, you will be equipped with a grenade launcher, so they are pretty easy to kill as well. What makes these guys somewhat difficult to kill is their sporadic movement. They can jump around and crawl on walls, so you'll need to avoid their attacks and wait for them to stop moving so you can get a clean shot. The next new enemy is a Ricka remix of an old one. This lovely fellow is the Hunter Beta, and the player first encounters them in the hospital. These hunters are a little bit more fucked up looking compared to their RE1 counterparts, hence the whole beta theme. They act much like the original hunters do. They move fast, can jump around and all that stuff. Basically, they just feel like a reskin of the hunter, so not much new to report on that front, but they are still pretty dangerous, but nothing the grenade launcher or shotgun can't handle. Finally are the Hunter Gammas, and wow, these things are super fucking disappointing. They are an alternative form of the hunter designed for chilling out in water. The Hunter Gamma are generally weaker than the standard hunter, but can jump much further. They are first encountered in the basement of the hospital, but instead of hanging around to see what they did, I just kind of hoofed it out of there. The problem with these guys is they are designed to stalk the waters, and since the game takes place in a massive city, there isn't really that many opportunities for them to actually be around. In fact, I think I barely have enough footage of them for this section of the video. Their design is pretty interesting, like a frog-like thing, but I just wish I had more opportunities to encounter them. One interesting thing about the enemies is that their placement is also randomized. I don't know if this is for all enemies throughout the entire game, but it is definitely for certain locations. Meaning you may enter an area infested with hunters, and if you die and go to the same place again, this time prepared to fight what killed you, it may be populated by sliding worms, which are another type of enemy, but one I barely encountered, so I'm not gonna fucking talk about them really. This keeps the game's unpredictability both upon death and multiple playthroughs. Learning enemy locations was an extremely important piece of information in the previous games, and the player could use that information while backtracking or upon deaths. But in Resident Evil 3, the tension of exploring areas remains high, as the player never really knows what to expect. This does mean that the perfect placement of the older enemies is somewhat gone, but this random element of the game is something I really appreciate. Now we get on to the big boy. Nemesis is the big new thing in Resident Evil 3. So much so that his name is plastered on the box alongside his handsome mug. Ooh. Hello. As I mentioned before, he is yet another one of Umbrella's fun little science experiments designed to hunt down the members of RPD's STARS unit. Basically, it's just like testing out if he can do it, I think. His design, though, is iconic. His body wrapped in leather, tubes piercing his skin, which is decayed and torn. His dead eyes alongside his beautifully white teeth make him such a memorable foe, and if you play your cards right, a memorable lover. Remember Mr. X from Resident Evil 2? I like his inclusion in the B scenario as it was a way of keeping the player on their toes. My biggest issue with that lumbering buffoon is that he wasn't really a threat. threat and was restricted to only a few specific moments in the game. In my review, I talked about how I wanted him to stalk the player, and I wish he was more versatile as a foe. Instead, he was just a guy who would occasionally remind you he existed from time to time. Nemesis, on the other hand, is everything I wanted from Mr. X, for better and for worse. Nemesis is dangerous. He's extremely fast, has numerous attacks that can hit from close or long distance. He hits like a fucking truck and takes a lot of ammunition to put him on the ground. You encounter him in several scripted sequences, but what makes him an actual prominent threat is he will stalk the player throughout most of the game. Whether indoors or outdoors, Nemesis is always hunting you. And even when he isn't, still feels like he is. You could be wandering around the city streets and he will just sprint down the road with murder on the mind. Or you could be exploring indoors and he will smash through a window and chase you through every room, killing anything, even zombies and other monsters that get in the way of his goal, killing you. Hardly anywhere is safe. You can't just move to the next room and think you'll be all good, because Nemesis can do something that Mr. X can't. That is open doors. This made me say, oh fuck, out loud. The presence of Nemesis makes Resident Evil 3 one of the most tension-filled experiences I've ever had, and for the first playthrough, he could be a fucking nightmare. By and large, a lot of Resident Evil 3 is pretty standard Resident Evil, but what Nemesis does is makes the player have to do the Resident Evil stuff while under duress. By the third entry, players have become accustomed to the Resident Evil formula. We all know what we need to do when we boot up one of these games. Run around, solve puzzles, dodge enemies, etc. Throwing Nemesis into the mix forces the player to re-evaluate situations and paths in a new and unique way, and he makes backtracking also so much more fucking dangerous. Sure, there were always obstacles in the player's path they needed to consider in previous games, as that it is a quintessential aspect of the survival horror genre, but all the planning in the world, all the item management, strategic play, and map memorization can get thrown out the window when you have a hulking behemoth Usain bolting towards you with the intent of murder. It makes Resident Evil 3 unlike any other entry in the franchise, and honestly, no other game in the series up to now has been able to capture this kind of panic that Nemesis makes the player experience. But all of this can also be a little bit frustrating, and Nemesis can turn into an annoyance. I had a few moments where all I wanted to do was progress in the game, but Nemesis would always show up at the worst times. Now, I just spent some time praising how he does that, but because I didn't have enough resources or didn't want to waste someone trying to down him for a period of time, he would turn from an ongoing threat into a bit of an annoying roadblock. Like, I just wanted to grab something or explore an area more thoroughly, but I couldn't do that because this fast motherfucker just wouldn't let me. So instead of soaking in this game and the world, I was forced to either run back to a safe room or just run to the next portion to progress. His speed and tactical options made trying to just avoid him while trying to do what I wanted to do nearly impossible. I will talk more about how the game wasn't completely balanced around an enemy with such a unique moveset and combat set in the boss section, but for now, I just wanted to say that he can be a bit annoying when you want to soak in the atmosphere or just explore, which is something that always hooked me when playing Resident Evil. There are sections where you can do this, as he will take a break from chasing you for a bit, so in these moments, you can really explore and prepare. But in a game where the player is required to really prepare themselves for what is to come, more so than any other game, Nemesis can interfere with that and leave the player unprepared for later parts. This is the only Resi game where I truly felt items were limited, which I know is a major part of Resident Evil, and I believe one of the reasons is because Nemesis stopped me from stocking up. The ammo crafting system may have been a way to accommodate for this, but you still need to explore to grab the ammo powder, so the issue persists. This isn't a major problem though, but I thought I should acknowledge it. If you do have the confidence to fight and kill Nemesis, he will be kind enough to drop some items. These range from weapon parts that, when combined, create new and more powerful weapons, or packs of first aid sprays. This really rewards the player for threatening their life and wasting their ammo to take down Nemesis. Now, I never did this because I fucking suck at fighting Nemesis, but if I had the confidence, I would have really loved a bigger shotgun. Overall, Nemesis was a breath of fresh air. 3 games in, the devs knew they need to really mix things up to keep things from getting stale, and since they had such a small development time, Nemesis was a great way of innovating and keeping things fresh without having to overhaul the core gameplay, but also making the core gameplay more intense. He does everything that Mr. X couldn't do, and he makes Resident Evil 3 one of the most nail-bitingly tense horror games of all time, in my opinion. But now we talked about the enemies, we got to get on to the big bad bosses, and yet again, I got a wish fulfilled. In my Resident Evil 2 review, I said I enjoyed Birkin as a main antagonist, who the player fights several times, but in order to keep these encounters fresh, he transforms, which changes his movement and attack capabilities. But he wasn't as persistent. Nemesis is the main antagonist of Resident Evil 3, and he will be the main boss the player fights. Though you can fight him when you run into the boy within the streets or other places, there are several actual boss fights with him, and with each fight he mutates, giving some new attacks and keeping the fights fresh. These are fucking hard. Nemesis's fast speed and vast movement set aren't too much of a problem in the open setting of the game, where you're going from place to place and exploring, but the boss fights are restricted to certain confined areas and he can quickly become overwhelming. The main problem is that he's just so fucking fast. I kept trying to get some distance between him and I so I could do some damage, but every time I tried, he would quickly close the gap and hit me as I was pulling out my gun. So boss fights would turn into this weird cat and mouse back and forth between us until one of us was dead. Most of the time, it was me. Now I know in my previous reviews, I wish boss fights demanded more from the player than just running from one corner to another and shooting the boss until they are dead. And I know I said those fights were too easy, but this seems like an overcorrection. And also, the boss fights are built around the dodge button working when the player wanted. But as I mentioned before, the dodge doesn't really work as intended. So you constantly fight this fast, tough enemy, and the only tool that you have at your disposal that can make these fights somewhat even between the pair of you doesn't even work. Even though I'm complaining about these, I'm so glad the boss fights with Nemesis are the way they are. It was like a shock to the system in the first fight. I thought to myself, oh, so shit is hard now. Okay, I'm fucking down. Every fight with Nemesis was extremely tense and exhilarating, with some frustrations at times. One of the fights also have several options in dealing damage. You can shoot these pipes or whatever to spill acid or something on him, which does deal some good damage and saves ammo. I screamed thank you at my screen when I realized this. But also Nemesis being the actual antagonist makes all these boss fights feel like they have meaning. Nemesis is the culmination of 2 games worth of boss designs and addressed nearly every problem I have with them in prior games. I do wish the dodge mechanic worked so I had some more options, because without it, I am just still running around in circles like in the other games. But Nemesis even made doing that repetitive thing feel like I was pulling off intricate combat maneuvers. Nemesis isn't the only boss fight though. There is this worm. Fighting him is shit and easy. That's all I've got to say about that. The quality of environments haven't changed much since Resident Evil 2, which is not an insult because that game blew me away with how good it looked, so the same goes here. Shit looks nice, but where there is a major improvement is just how much is going on in these backgrounds. Because the game is set during the midst of a zombie apocalypse, the developers went absolutely crazy on the streets of Raccoon City and encapsulate this craziness. Buildings and storefronts are destroyed, their windows shattered and the insides have been destroyed and ransacked. Cars remain vacant in the aftermath of a crash, their metal crumpled and scratched. Their windows remain open as though something pulled out the drivers. Even some people who have turned into zombies laying waiting for the right moment to launch at their next meal. Rubbish, broken glass, blood and bodies litter the streets. Those who are lucky remain corpses, those who aren't get back up. Fires burn uncontrollably while smoke consumes the streets. New 3D environmental effects add a nice layer of atmosphere. Bugs will circle around a street lamp and rain will pour from the pitch black sky. There are many alleys, buildings and areas a player can explore, and it's an awesome change of pace from the level design in previous games. There are so many interesting and unique places to go to, and though the player will run into a lot of straight lines while exploring Raccoon City, it feels more alive and believable because the game is set in a city. The streets of Raccoon City have been painted with a brush of indiscriminate violence, and every nook and cranny of the environment tells their own unique story of suffering, and it's fucking beautiful. We get to visit a familiar place as well, that being the police department, but a little more barricaded as Jill takes a trip there before it's completely destroyed. It is really cool to come back here and get to explore it during a different period of time. It is a lot more shut off than in the original though. You only go there for a minute, explore a few rooms and leave. But it was fun to actually have Jill, a member of STARS, be able to explore her workplace. I just wish she had some unique dialogue though. I would have liked to see her comment about the Arclay Mansion incident or talk about Wesker when you check her desk. Instead, I think most of the text is just copied straight from Resident Evil 2, which is kinda lame. I would have also liked to see some other police officers there as well. Like, it would have been kind of cool just to have like more people, like more actual alive people in this game, but hey, we got a couple. The rest of the areas are pretty varied as well. The player will explore cemeteries, a fucking awesome clock tower, a creepy park, a hospital, and of course, another umbrella lab. These guys sure like building those. But what I love about Resident Evil 3 is that it addresses one of the main problems of the previous games. That being, they become a straight line to the finish once the player gets out of the main area. But Capcom must have time traveled and watched my videos because in Resident Evil 3, the game is smaller but more open areas reminiscent of the Spencer Mansion or RPD. The game's pacing is so much better for it. It doesn't feel like the game is rushing me to the end, even though it would have been thematically appropriate in this entry. Resident Evil 3 just feels more consistent in terms of its levels. Not spending loads of times in one place and then blitzing past several areas in a dizzy haze is just such a better experience. The clock tower is awesome to wander around in. It has this gothic mansion vibe similar to the Spencer Mansion. Each room is something cool to look at. The park is really atmospheric, place full of tight walkways and dark corners. I also imagine this place is just creepy even without the whole zombie apocalypse thing going on. The hospital is a really fucking cool place to explore, and I'm surprised it took 2 games to kind of get here. Like, of course you want to explore a hospital in a zombie outbreak. Like, that's just like the best place to have a look in. The lab is just a lab, but it does offer some unique areas with interesting enemy placements that makes it feel really dangerous. Resident Evil 3 allows the player to really explore several locations in Raccoon City and really get a feel for the mood of the place. I wish Resident Evil 2 did this a bit more because it just feels right in a series such as this. The actual character models in Resident Evil 3 have received a slight downgrade. Nothing too drastic, but it was very very noticeable when I booted up the game for the first time on my PC. I thought I did something wrong, but nah, this is just how the game looks. Models are still detailed, but look a little bit more muddy, and each character does have a distinct look, and their designs are still memorable as well. But the reason why the graphics dropped a little was because the game was pushing the limit of how many enemies you could have in one screen or in one area. There are fucking loads of undead and monsters created in a lab wandering around. The zombies especially look awesome as their models are way more varied than both prior Resident Evil games. The lower visual quality is a clear design sacrifice in order to really capture the mood of a zombie apocalypse. I wouldn't have believed a few zombies and monsters here and there could have overthrown an entire city. So the devs knew they needed to show the sheer size of the outbreak at the cost of some muddier visuals. And honestly, I think it was a good decision. Overall, the visuals, the environment, and the level design feel like a breath of fresh air for the series. It addressed all my problems and then some. The static backgrounds are the best in the series so far, and though the models look a little bit worse, that is more than made up with the sheer size of the outbreak. Because if it wasn't believable, it would have taken away from the frantic and intense nature of the game. But thankfully, Capcom made Resident Evil 3 look and feel like a city overrun by the undead, and I loved exploring every single area.
No!
This is the first time me talking about the music and sound, so be gentle. The music in Resident Evil 3 retains that classic atmospheric sound the series is known for, but contorts itself to match the frantic tone of this game. Lots of tracks feature action movie style orchestra sounds, big booming strings, and even distorted bass lines, but with a Resident Evil twist. The song Watch Your Back is a great example of this. It feels haunting, the strings are twisted, shifting in pitch within one note, making the track feel dreamlike, but with sharp notes piercing the ears, giving that sense of urgency. While the track Unstoppable Nemesis is the perfect music to accompany that big boy. It is booming. There's crashing sounds in the background accompanied by sharp strings, while other strings comprise the melody. Every instrument is designed to make Nemesis sound menacing. But then you have tracks like Valediction in the Park, which harken back to the more somber and creepy tones found in Resident Evil 1. They feature low drones echoing in the background, again with the strings, but they hold their notes for much longer than in the more frantic songs, providing an eerie soundscape. These songs are the perfect accompaniment to the more slower, atmospheric, and exploratory moments of the game. The music does a great job at providing tones for both the creepier parts of Resident Evil 3 and the more action-packed, frantic moments. And some tracks even seamlessly transition between the two. I think this is some peak music right here. It nails everything the game was going for tonally and made an already creepy, frantic game that much more creepy and frantic. The sound design and voice acting is also top-notch, well, for Resident Evil at least. All the weapons, monsters, and environmental sounds are really fucking good. The weapons pack a serious punch. The pistol still sounds kind of meh like it always has in Resident Evil, but the shotgun, grenade launcher, and magnum all pack a wallop. They really sound like they are devastating weapons, and I don't know about you, but I would not like to be shot by them. All the monsters sound basically the same as they did before, but just a bit cleaner and more distinct, which is a triumph considering how many more of them are on the screen at once. But easily, the environmental sounds are my favourite. Though most of the game is frantic like I have mentioned many times, Resident Evil 3 also has got quiet moments, and that is when we really get to hear such an awesome soundscape. Jill's steps echo through the back alleys of Raccoon City. You can hear zombies munching on someone from beyond the next screen, but you don't know exactly where they are, so that screen transition is very tense. Hearing Nemesis sprinting towards you from somewhere unseen is one of the most fucking crazy things I've ever experienced. The sound design in general is just treated with such care to really elevate the game and provide scares before the player even knows what they should be scared of. The voice acting is as cheesy as ever, and that is damn alright with me. Jill is much more of a character in this game, and that is purely based on her delivery. She is more sarcastic, and that is perfectly delivered in the actor's vocal performance.
Considering Umbrella caused all this in the first place, those liars!
Jill just always sounds cynical, like she is constantly thinking, not this shit again. Carlos sounds less like a hardened mercenary, more like an office worker who wouldn't hurt a fly.
You're giving up?
No. I can't handle it.
His voice actor can be a bit cringy at times too, but he doesn't sound too out of place, I guess. Nikolai sounds like someone doing a really bad impression of a Russian accent, like he just sounds too evil, as though he's in a film about the Red Scare or something. It does match the cheesy tone though, so it was actually enjoyable to hear this evil fucker just be evil and enjoy it.
What did you do?
I had no choice. He was about to turn into a zombie. It would have been a threat, so I eliminated it.
3 games in and the voice acting has improved so fucking much from the original. Every character still has that B-movie charm that was unintentionally established in the first one, but it has grown up alongside the franchise to offer a more rounded and somewhat serious delivery, especially when the script calls for it. But Jill is easily the standout character, and so far, she is my favourite character in the franchise based purely on how she sounds and acts in this game. Resident Evil 3 is a beast of a game to play. I have rarely experienced something so tense, and it is the first entry in the series that actually kept me on the edge of my seat. It was an uncomfortable time as well, which makes me hesitant to go back and play it as much as 2. But that's not me saying this isn't a good game. It's a fucking great game. It perfectly executes the tone it was going for, introduces the best version of Jill, explores an iconic location, and features one of the most memorable enemies in all of horror games. Nemesis is truly the shining point of this game. He elevates it from just being a standard Resident Evil game and makes it one of true chaos. The puzzles finally resemble puzzles, and there are hardly any box puzzles either, which arouses me, and I haven't felt anything in years. The level design is finally more open throughout the entire game, and the environments look fucking amazing. The music is chaotic and atmospheric, and the environmental sounds provide some truly disturbing moments. The story is an action blockbuster set in a zombie-infested city with an antagonist who is actually intimidating. Every aspect of the game still falls into some Resident Evil cliches here and there, but those parts are so fucking charming they can't be mad at them. But Resident Evil 3 will kick you in the ass a lot on your first playthrough, and though it can feel a bit cheap sometimes, I think the decision to ramp up the difficulty was a great idea, as the previous 2 games were just too easy. Resident Evil 3 should not be the first game in the series you play, but you also should not skip it. It feels like this game is Capcom challenging the diehard of Resident Evil fans. You reckon you know this series and can speedrun any game first go? Well, fuck you bitches, here's Nemesis. I loved my time with Resident Evil 3 Nemesis and dreaded having to pick it up again for this review, and I believe that perfectly encapsulates just how great of a survival horror game it is.
Thank you for watching this long ass video about all the classic Resident Evil video games. If you liked it all, give me a like and subscribe and all that jazz. It means a lot and it helps the channel grow, so yeah. And I will see you guys in the next one, hopefully very soon, but I can't promise anything because I'm fucking shit. Okay, bye!